In early November of 2021, a 42-year-old digital forensic audio analyst named Jason Miller was working out of his private studio in Flagstaff, Arizona. Jason was an independent contractor who spent years cleaning up degraded audio recordings for regional legal firms, insurance disputes, and private investigations across Coconino County. He possessed top-tier spectral enhancement software, specialized noise reduction hardware, and an exceptional ear for isolating acoustic background anomalies that ordinary listeners completely overlooked. For most of his career, the work was technical, predictable, and quiet. But everything changed on the afternoon of the 9th of November 2021 when an elderly woman named Evelyn Cross walked into his downtown office carrying a battered cardboard box. Evelyn was 76 years old, visibly frail, and carried the heavy, unmistakable exhaustion of someone who had lived through decades of unresolved grief. Exactly 20 years prior, on the freezing night of the 12th of November 2001, Evelyn's 19-year-old daughter, Kendra Cross, vanished without a trace from the rural outskirts of Sedona. Kendra had been a bright, quiet art student at the local community college. On the night she disappeared, she was driving her 1,997 green Honda Civic along an isolated stretch of Highway 89A through Oak Creek Canyon, heading home from an evening pottery class. Her vehicle was discovered early the following morning, abandoned on the gravel shoulder near an unpaved scenic turnout. The car was entirely undamaged, the doors were unlocked, the keys were still sitting on the passenger seat, and Kendra's purse, cash, and jacket were left inside. An extensive 3-week multi-agency search through the Red Rock Wilderness, dry creek beds, and steep canyons yielded zero physical evidence. There were no signs of a struggle, no blood, no foreign tire marks, and no footprints in the hard-packed red dirt. Over the years, the case grew ice cold, sitting in the archives of the Coconino County Sheriff Department as one of the region's most baffling unsolved missing persons cases. Evelyn set the cardboard box on Jason's desk. Inside was an old, discolored Panasonic landline telephone with a built-in digital answering machine manufactured in the late 1990s. Evelyn explained in a quiet, trembling voice that on the night Kendra disappeared, around 11:45 in the evening, the landline phone at their family home in Sedona had recorded an incoming voicemail message. When Evelyn and her late husband played the recording the next morning, all they heard was 30 seconds of distorted static wind rushing past a receiver and a series of muffled mechanical clicks. The local police had listened to it back in 2001 with the analog equipment available at the time, dismissed it as a corrupted pocket dial or an empty line from an automated telemarketer, and returned the machine to the family. Evelyn had kept that answering machine in her closet for 2 decades, preserving the digital flash memory chip by keeping the backup battery compartment dry and untouched. With the 20th anniversary of Kendra's disappearance approaching, Evelyn asked Jason if modern digital filtering tools could extract anything meaningful from the recording before she passed away. Jason took the assignment. He carefully extracted the uncompressed raw audio file directly from the answering machine's internal solid-state memory, imported the waveform into his high-end digital audio workstation, and spent the entire evening analyzing the file. The raw recording was 32 seconds long. When played at normal volume through high-end studio reference monitors, the audio was dominated by a harsh, continuous roar of wind shear and low-frequency electrical hum, completely masking whatever faint acoustics lay beneath. Jason began applying high-pass filters to strip away the low-end rumble. He then initiated a multi-band spectral subtraction process to isolate and remove the repetitive white noise of the cellular carrier band. As the layers of static were systematically peeled away, the audio waveform began to reveal a complex, multi-layered acoustic environment. At approximately 11 seconds into the recording, Jason heard the faint, distinct sound of a vehicle door closing with a heavy, hollow thud. It was not the light, tinny click of Kendra's compact Honda Civic door. It was the deep, heavy, metallic slam of a full-size steel truck door. Jason paused the playback, feeling a sudden chill prickle across the back of his neck. He zoomed in on the timeline between seconds 14 and 22, boosting the mid-range frequencies where human vocal patterns typically sit. He routed the isolated audio channel through a real-time vocal declipper and turned the output monitor knob up. Through his studio headphones, a human voice cut through the background silence. It was faint, hoarse, and breathless, but unmistakably the voice of a terrified young woman whispering directly into the phone's microphone. "Mom, I got in the back." He told me the pass was closed. "We just crossed the cattle grate near the microwave tower. He has a red." The voice cut off abruptly as a sharp, loud burst of acoustic interference tore across the track. Jason's hands hovered over the mixing console, his heart thumping hard against his chest. Kendra had not been snatched from the roadside by force. She had been deceived. Someone in a large truck had pulled up beside her broken-down car, lied to her about road closures through the canyon, offered her a ride, and she had gotten into the vehicle voluntarily. Jason immediately focused on the final 10 seconds of the recording, where the loud acoustic interference occurred. He ran the signal through a spectral frequency analyzer to determine what caused the sudden burst. The visual display revealed that the noise was not simple line static. It was a rhythmic, mechanical resonance that repeated at exact 80 millisecond intervals, accompanied by an underlying low-frequency droning sound. Jason adjusted the equalization curve, pulling out the harsh treble spikes and amplifying the acoustic reflections bouncing off nearby surfaces. As the sound cleared up, Jason realized he was listening to the interior of a running vehicle cabin. In the background, behind the mechanical resonance, was a steady, rhythmic clicking sound, the distinct acoustic tick of a mechanical mileage odometer wheel rolling over. And directly underneath that clicking, playing through a low-quality dashboard speaker inside the truck, was a faint audio broadcast. Jason boosted the radio signal by 18 decibels, isolating the voice of a late-night talk radio host. The radio host was discussing a regional high school football championship game between Page and Winslow, an actual broadcast that had aired live across northern Arizona on the night of the 12th of November 2001. Then, right at the 27-second mark, as the truck slowed down, another sound emerged on the track. It was the distinct, high-pitched mechanical whine of a heavy, two-way commercial CB radio transmission clicking open, followed by a harsh, deep male voice speaking inside the cab. Base 4. "This is Unit 7. The gate at the cinder pit is locked. I am taking the access road down to the old timber lease." The male voice paused, and in the final 3 seconds of the voicemail, the microphone picked up the sound of a heavy, unlubricated handbrake lever ratcheting upward with 6 sharp, distinct clicks, followed by the metallic chime of a vehicle door opening into the freezing wind. Then, the call terminated with a sharp digital drop. Jason sat frozen in his ergonomic chair, staring at the glowing green waveforms on his triple monitor array. The background details were extraordinarily specific. The mention of the microwave tower, the cattle grate, the cinder pit, the old timber lease, and the unit identifier base 4 were not random phrases. They were geographic markers and operational call signs. The following morning, the 10th of November, 2021, Jason took his laptop, the enhanced audio files, and a printed forensic transcript directly to the Coconino County Sheriff Department headquarters in Flagstaff, requesting an immediate meeting with the Cold Case Homicide Division. Detective Marcus Vance, a seasoned 30-year veteran investigator who had originally worked as a junior deputy during the 2001 search for Kendra Cross, agreed to review the material. Marcus sat in the precinct conference room, slipping on a pair of over-ear studio monitors as Jason played the isolated, enhanced audio tracks step by step. As the whispering voice of Kendra Cross filled the room, followed by the deep voice of the truck driver announcing his location over the CB radio, Marcus Vance's face turned an ashen shade of pale. Marcus stood up from the conference table, walked over to the precinct archival map cabinet, and pulled out a large, laminated forestry map of Coconino County from 2001. He traced his finger from Highway 89A in Oak Creek Canyon, heading north toward the high volcanic plateaus of the San Francisco Peaks. There was only one location in the entire county that matched every single auditory clue on the voicemail. 12 miles north of Flagstaff, along an unpaved logging route off Highway 180, sat an old volcanic cinder quarry that had been operated by a regional aggregate excavation company in the late 1990s and early 2000s. Directly adjacent to the cinder pit was a high-altitude telecommunications microwave relay tower accessible only by crossing a heavy steel cattle guard grate set into the forestry road. And running directly behind the cinder quarry was a decommissioned 40-mile network of private logging roads that cut deep into the dense, uninhabited ponderosa pine forests of the Mogollon Rim. Marcus Vance immediately ran the commercial fleet registry for the aggregate excavation company that had held the mining lease on that cinder pit in November of 2001. The company had operated a small fleet of 9 heavy-duty commercial dump trucks and maintenance utility vehicles. Every vehicle had been equipped with private commercial CB radios assigned to specific operational unit numbers. Unit 7 was a red 10-ton commercial Kenworth utility flatbed truck, assigned exclusively to a single overnight maintenance mechanic who lived on a secluded 5-acre parcel off Forest Service Road 151. Marcus clicked on the employee registry file from November 2001, pulling up the state driver's license photo and personal history of the man who had been operating Unit 7 on the night Kendra Cross vanished. As the photograph loaded on the precinct terminal, Detective Vance looked at the screen, his breath catching in his throat. The man pictured in the file was 58-year-old Donald Ray Croft. Donald had worked as the night mechanic for the aggregate company for 15 years before abruptly quitting his job in January of 2002, 2 months after Kendra's disappearance, claiming he was retiring due to chronic health issues. County land records showed that Donald had never left northern Arizona. For the past 20 years, he had continued living as a complete recluse on that exact same 5-acre wooded parcel bordering the national forest, off the very logging road mentioned in the 20-year-old voicemail. Marcus Vance did not hesitate. He coordinated with the Arizona Department of Public Safety, secured an emergency expedited search warrant signed by a county superior court judge based on the newly enhanced digital audio evidence, and assembled a tactical convoy of 4 unmarked sheriff SUVs and a mobile forensic command unit. At approximately 2:15 on the afternoon of the 11th of November 2021, the tactical convoy turned off Highway 180, crossing the heavy steel cattle guard beside the rusted microwave relay tower, and drove down the unpaved forest track toward Donald Croft's secluded property. The property was surrounded by dense ponderosa pines, completely isolated behind a rusted chain-link fence. Tucked beneath the trees was a dilapidated, single-story modular home with boarded-up windows, accompanied by a massive corrugated steel mechanics workshop at the rear of the clearing. Parked beside the workshop, half hidden beneath an oxidized green canvas tarp and covered in 20 years of pine needles, was the unmistakable shape of a vintage red Kenworth utility flatbed truck. Detectives and armed tactical deputies moved swiftly across the muddy gravel surrounding the modular residence and the steel workshop with weapons drawn. Marcus Vance stepped up to the front door of the workshop, flanked by 2 deputies with breaching tools, and shouted through the metal door, announcing the presence of the Coconino County Sheriff Department with a search warrant. There was no verbal response from inside the building. Instead, from deep within the cavernous, unlit interior of the steel workshop, the detectives heard the slow, heavy clank of a metal sliding latch being drawn back, followed by the faint, distinct mechanical hiss of an industrial hydraulic lift, slowly lowering a heavy iron platform down into an underground concrete pit beneath the floorboards. Detective Marcus Vance did not wait for the hydraulic mechanism to complete its cycle. He gave the signal, and two tactical deputies drove a heavy hydraulic ram into the workshop doorframe, shattering the industrial lock with a deafening bang. Armed deputies swept into the cavernous steel building with weapon lights blazing. The workshop smelled heavily of old gear oil, stale grease, and cold hydraulic fluid. At the center of the concrete floor was a recessed commercial automotive service bay, where a heavy steel plate had been modified into an improvised elevator platform descending 12 feet down into a reinforced subterranean bunker. Tactical officers covered the descent as Detective Vance climbed down the iron rungs of the pit ladder. Huddled at the back of the underground concrete chamber, surrounded by rows of old truck parts and tool racks, was 78-year-old Donald Ray Croft. He offered no resistance, dropping a pair of heavy pliers to the floor and raising his oil-stained hands as deputies placed him in steel handcuffs. Forensic units immediately descended on the property, conducting a comprehensive 72-hour excavation of the mechanic shop, the bunker, and the surrounding 5 acres of dense ponderosa pine forest. Hidden behind a false drywall partition in the underground service pit, crime scene technicians uncovered a locked metal firebox. Inside the box were Kendra Cross's student identification card, her house keys, and the missing silver necklace she had been wearing on the night of the 12th of November 2001. A ground-penetrating radar survey of the wooded perimeter led investigators to a shallow depression beneath a stand of young pines, where forensic anthropologists recovered Kendra's human remains, finally bringing her 20-year disappearance to a definitive, heartbreaking end. During subsequent interrogations with state prosecutors, Donald Ray Croft broke down and confessed to the crime. He admitted that on the night of the 12th of November 2001, he had spotted Kendra's stalled Civic on Highway 89. While driving the commercial utility truck back to the cinder quarry, he exploited the remote mountain setting, telling her that an early winter rockslide had closed the Lower Canyon Pass, offering to drive her to the highway maintenance depot to make a phone call. When Kendra grew suspicious of the unpaved logging detour and attempted to use her cellular phone to leave a hidden voicemail for her mother, Croft realized what she was doing. He pulled the truck over at the cinder pit gate, overpowered her, and brought her to his isolated workshop. Croft was formally indicted on charges of first-degree premeditated murder, aggravated kidnapping, and evidence tampering. In March of 2022, facing the death penalty, Croft accepted a plea agreement, pleading guilty to all counts, and was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole at the Arizona State Prison Complex in Florence. On the 12th of November 2022, exactly 21 years to the day after she vanished, Kendra Cross was laid to rest in a peaceful memorial park in Sedona, with her mother, Evelyn, family members, and Detective Marcus Vance in attendance. Jason Miller returned the restored answering machine to Evelyn, having proven that even when 2 decades of silence settle over an unsolved tragedy, the truth has a way of cutting through the static when the right person is finally listening. In late December of 2021, a 32-year-old freelance mapmaker and geographical data surveyor named Isaac Sterling lived in total isolation on the eastern slopes of the Green Mountains near the small town of Warren, Vermont. Isaac spent the majority of his professional life processing satellite telemetry, drawing high-precision topographical trail guides, and working in complete digital solitude. When a major geographical foundation awarded him a multi-year grant to map regional mountain drainages, he chose to live where the work was right outside his back door. The house he rented was an A-frame timber cabin perched along an unpaved logging route known as Lincoln Gap Road. The structure sat on a heavily wooded 4-acre shelf of land surrounded by dense stands of sugar, maple, paper birch, and towering eastern hemlocks. During the warmer summer months, tourists occasionally drove through the mountain pass, but by late autumn, the town municipality shut down the road gates due to extreme ice and drifting snow, cutting off vehicle access entirely until spring. For 5 continuous months every winter, the only way in or out was by snowmobile or snowshoes. The nearest permanent neighbor lived more than 2 miles down the valley, Isaac loved the extreme seclusion. His cabin had a stone hearth that provided steady heat, a high-speed satellite uplink powered by solar batteries and a propane generator, and a wide second-floor loft that served as his bedroom and workspace. His companion was a 3-year-old German Shepherd mix named Jasper, an energetic, highly observant dog who usually alerted Isaac to every passing white-tailed deer or foraging black bear in the tree line. On the morning of the 22nd of December 2021, a massive winter storm swept across northern New England, dumping nearly 14 inches of pristine, powdery snow across the mountains. The wind howled through the timber frame all afternoon, shaking the glass gables and burying the front porch in thick, sculptured drifts. By midnight, the storm system broke completely, leaving behind an eerie, crystal-clear night sky with temperatures plummeting down to 7 degrees below zero. At approximately 7 o'clock the following morning, Isaac woke up to make his usual pot of dark roast coffee. He strapped on his insulated winter boots, pulled on a heavy fleece jacket, and stepped out onto the wide front porch with a snow shovel to clear the path leading down to the firewood shed. The morning air was razor sharp, freezing the moisture in his nostrils with every deep breath. The entire forest was painted in blinding white, bathed in absolute dead silence. There was no wind, no sound of distant traffic, and no bird calls. As Isaac pushed his shovel into the first fresh drift at the base of the porch stairs, his eyes caught a dark, broken pattern across the pristine surface of the snow. Beginning near the dense spruce thicket at the northern edge of his property line, a single line of deep, clean footprints cut straight across the virgin snowdrifts, heading directly toward the cabin. Isaac stopped shoveling, leaning on the wooden handle of his shovel. At first glance, he assumed a wandering hunter, an off-trail snowshoer, or a backcountry skier from the Sugarbush Resort had lost their way during the blizzard. But as Isaac walked closer to inspect the impressions, a strange wave of disorientation washed over him. The footprints had not been made by snowshoes, nor were they made by the heavy, lugged tread of modern winter mountaineering boots. The impressions were completely smooth on the bottom, narrow, and elongated, measuring roughly 12 inches in length. They looked exactly like the imprint of bare human feet, wrapped tightly in thin strips of coarse, untreated canvas or burlap. Even stranger was the gait. The stride length between each footprint was unnervingly long, spaced nearly 5 feet apart, meaning whoever made them was either extraordinarily tall or was taking massive, bounding strides through 14 inches of dense, freezing powder without dragging their feet. Isaac knelt down, placing his gloved hand into the center of the freshest print. The edges of the snow were sharp, crisp, and completely unmarred by wind drift. The tracks had been made within the last 2 hours, long after the blizzard had stopped falling around 5 in the morning. Isaac stood up and looked back toward the woods. A natural survival instinct urged him to go back inside, bolt the heavy oak door, and call the state police dispatcher in Waterbury. But Isaac was a cartographer and tracker by trade. His entire life was built around mapping terrain, reading physical signs on the earth, and understanding pathways. He whistled for Jasper, but the dog refused to step off the wooden porch deck, sitting rigidly by the front door, with his ears pinned flat against his head, staring silently into the trees with a low, nervous tremor in his chest. Isaac walked over to the firewood shed, picked up a heavy, steel-shafted splitting maul for protection, and strapped a pair of lightweight aluminum snowshoes onto his winter boots. He decided to follow the tracks backward to their point of origin, determined to find out who had walked onto his isolated mountain property in sub-zero weather without proper boots. The trail led Isaac across the open clearing, weaving through a dense cluster of young birch saplings, and descended into a steep, heavily shadowed ravine where a frozen mountain brook ran between granite ledges. As Isaac pushed through the knee-deep snow, the track pattern became increasingly bizarre. The footprints never hesitated. They did not slip on the icy shale near the brook, nor did they show any signs of fatigue on the steep uphill climbs. In several places, the tracks passed directly beneath low, jagged hemlock branches that sat barely 4 feet above the snow line. Yet, there were no broken twigs, no brushed-off snow, and no knee prints. As though the individual had bent their upper torso completely backward or sideways while continuing forward in a seamless, unbroken stride. Isaac followed the line for nearly a mile and a half deep into the wilderness, crossing the boundary markers of the Green Mountain National Forest. The trail eventually led to the base of an old, crumbling stone foundation, the forgotten ruins of a 19th century timber mill that had burned down in the 1880s. In the center of the snow-covered stone ruins, the footprints abruptly stopped. Isaac stood amidst the frozen limestone blocks, scanning the undisturbed snow around him in a 360-degree circle. There were no tracks leading away. There were no tracks continuing up the mountain ridge. The line simply terminated at the edge of a deep, dark, vertical drainage well built from hand-cut fieldstone, descending 10 feet down into the frozen ground. Isaac approached the mouth of the well cautiously, holding the heavy splitting maul ready in his right hand. He leaned over the icy stone ledge and shone his headlamp beam downward into the dark shaft. The bottom of the well was completely dry, covered in a bed of dead brown hemlock needles and rotting wood scraps. Resting in the center of the stone pit was a torn, dirty sleeping bag, several strips of frayed burlap fabric covered in dried mud, and an open, rusted steel tin containing a small, modern handheld GPS unit whose green screen was slowly pulsing with a low battery indicator. Isaac felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. The GPS unit had a digital waypoint marked on the map screen. The waypoint coordinates were set to the exact geographical location of Isaac's cabin on Lincoln Gap Road. Isaac stepped back from the stone well, realizing with mounting panic that whoever had lived inside the pit was not a lost wanderer. The individual had tracked his property with deliberate, electronic precision. Isaac did not investigate further. He turned around on his snowshoes and began retracing his steps as fast as his legs could move through the heavy snow, the silence of the winter forest now feeling intensely predatory and hostile. As Isaac climbed back out of the ravine and approached the tree line bordering his own clearing, he noticed something in the snow that made his heart violently skip a beat. Right beside the original single line of burlap-wrapped footprints he had followed into the woods was a second, identical set of fresh tracks. This second set of tracks was heading in the exact opposite direction, traveling out of the deep ravine, moving parallel to his own return path, and breaking into the clearing around his cabin. The snow inside these new impressions was so fresh that small, loose ice crystals were still tumbling into the center of the heel marks. Whoever had made the tracks had not stayed at the old mill ruins. They had been in the woods the entire time, circling behind Isaac through the trees, tracking his movements, and heading straight back toward the clearing while he had been looking down into the stone well. Isaac broke into an exhausting sprint, his snowshoes kicking up plumes of powder as he burst through the hemlock canopy into the open yard, his eyes locked onto the front porch of the cabin. Jasper was no longer sitting on the deck. The heavy wooden front door of the cabin, which Isaac had firmly pulled shut when he walked out into the snow an hour earlier, was standing wide open by 4 inches. The second set of fresh, elongated footprints did not stop in the yard. They ascended the 3 wooden porch steps in clean, single bounds, crossed the cleared deck planks, and led directly over the wooden threshold, disappearing into the dark, warm interior of Isaac's home. Isaac stood at the bottom of the porch stairs, his lungs burning in the sub-zero air, the heavy steel splitting maul trembling in his grip. The silence radiating from inside the cabin was total and suffocating. There was no barking from Jasper, no sound of shifting floorboards, and no movement behind the frosted glass gables of the loft. Isaac kicked off his aluminum snowshoes with 2 quick, fluid motions, leaving them in the snow. He mounted the 3 porch steps in dead silence, keeping his weight over the structural stringers of the wood to avoid any telltale creaks. He reached the front door, wedging his boot against the base of the frame to keep it from swinging open wider. Through the 4-inch gap, a faint, sweet smell drifted out into the cold mountain air. The scent of his own morning coffee mingled with the damp, sour odor of melting snow, wet earth, and unwashed wool. Isaac took a deep breath, raised the heavy splitting maul above his right shoulder, kicked the door wide with his left boot, and stepped inside. The ground floor was cast in deep morning shadows, illuminated only by the gray daylight filtering through the south-facing casement windows. Sitting on the floor in the center of the living room rug, completely unharmed but paralyzed with fear, was Jasper. The dog was staring rigidly up at the open timber staircase that led to the second-floor loft. On the polished pine floorboards between the front entryway and the stairs was a distinct trail of melting, slush, and dark, wet burlap imprints. Isaac moved forward with agonizing slowness, his eyes locked on the edge of the second-floor landing. As he placed his boot on the third stair, a low, mechanical sound broke the silence from the loft above. It was the steady, rhythmic clicking of a computer keyboard. Isaac did not hesitate. He charged up the remaining steps, clearing the landing with the maul raised, his voice cutting through the house like a whip. "Get away from the desk!" Sitting in the ergonomic chair in front of Isaac's 3-monitor cartography workstation was a tall, skeletal man dressed in layers of frayed thermal underwear, his feet wrapped in thick bindings of burlap secured with heavy electrical wire. The man did not run, he did not lunge, he simply stopped typing, swiveled the chair slowly around on its casters, and looked directly into Isaac's eyes with a calm, vacant expression. Resting on his lap was an open, weathered topographical map from 1994, marked with hundreds of tiny red ink dots covering the Green Mountain Wilderness. Isaac kept the heavy steel blade of the maul pointed directly at the man's chest, backing toward the landline terminal on the wall to dial emergency dispatch. Within 40 minutes, 2 Vermont State Police cruisers and a specialized backcountry tactical unit from the Middlesex Barracks arrived on snowmobiles, breaching the gated pass and taking 44-year-old Silas Thorne into custody without resistance. When state police, detectives, and federal land investigators ran Thorne's fingerprints through the National Crime Information Center database, the terrifying truth of the mountain recluse was uncovered. Silas Thorne was a former state environmental surveyor and GIS mapping technician who had vanished from northern New Hampshire in 2016 following a severe psychiatric breakdown and an active warrant for criminal trespass and electronic stalking. Thorne had not been living in society for over 5 years. He had constructed a network of subterranean survival caches across the national forest, using historical topographical charts and stolen handheld GPS units to navigate the rugged wilderness completely off the grid. When Isaac Sterling rented the Lincoln Gap cabin to map the regional drainages, Thorne discovered that Isaac's high-resolution satellite database contained the updated, uncompressed geospatial files for the entire mountain range data that Thorne obsessively believed held the locations of forgotten survey markers from his past career. Thorne had spent 3 weeks observing the cabin from the tree line, memorizing Isaac's morning routines. On the morning of the blizzard, Thorne had deliberately laid down the bizarre, wide-strided footprints leading out toward the old mill ruins, anticipating that a trained cartographer and tracker, like Isaac, would follow the trail into the woods to investigate. The moment Isaac crossed into the ravine, Thorne circled through the dense timber, entered the unlocked cabin to access Isaac's computer workstation, and sat down to download the master mapping files onto a flash drive. Silas Thorne was charged with felony burglary, aggravated stalking, and unlawful entry, and was remanded to a state psychiatric security facility in Berlin, Vermont, for long-term clinical evaluation. Isaac Sterling terminated his lease on Lincoln Gap Road the following week. He relocated his cartography business to a secure, modern apartment in downtown Burlington. But for years afterward, whenever a fresh winter snowfall blanketed the ground outside his window, he never looked at a line of footprints without checking behind him to see where they were leading. In late September of 2018, A 28-year-old high-altitude trail runner and environmental science instructor named Julian Ward embarked on a solitary weekend trek through the rugged perimeter of the North Cascades National Park, located in northern Washington state. Julian was an exceptionally disciplined athlete who had spent nearly 8 years exploring some of the most unforgiving alpine landscapes in the Pacific Northwest. He possessed top-of-the-line cold-weather mountaineering gear, an advanced Garmin satellite communicator, and a deep, practical understanding of high-elevation survival. The specific area Julian chose for his weekend route was the remote Fisher Basin Trail, a notoriously steep and sparsely traveled corridor that branched off from the North Cross State Highway. The terrain in this part of the Cascades was defined by towering granite spires, vertical cirques, ancient glacial fields, and dense, tangled stands of western red cedar and Douglas fir that grew so thick in the lower drainages that sunlight rarely reached the forest floor. On the morning of the 21st of September 2018, at approximately 6 o'clock, Julian signed the voluntary trail registry at the Colonial Creek trailhead. He noted that his planned itinerary was a 60-mile loop over Easy Pass, descending into the Fisher Creek Valley and returning via the Thunder Creek Trail by the evening of September 23rd. The weather forecast for that weekend called for clear, unseasonably mild autumn conditions during the day, with high temperatures reaching 60 degrees, but dropping down near freezing once the sun dipped behind the jagged peaks. Julian was wearing a high-visibility cobalt blue windbreaker, black compression running tights, reinforced trail running gaiters, and carrying a compact 30-liter carbon frame backpack containing a 4-season bivy sack, high-calorie food rations, a lightweight water filtration pump, and a micro headlamp. For the first 36 hours, Julian's trek proceeded with textbook precision. His satellite tracking device sent an automated position ping back to his family in Bellingham every 2 hours, showing steady, strong progress up the grueling switchbacks toward the 9,000-foot ridgeline. On the evening of September 22nd at 7:30, Julian sent a manual text message through his satellite beacon from his high camp site near the head of Fisher Basin, camped at the upper tree line. Clear skies, no wind. Starting descent down the creek drainage at dawn. See you tomorrow evening. That was the last confirmed transmission ever received from Julian Ward. When Julian failed to arrive at the Thunder Creek trailhead by 9 o'clock on the evening of September 23rd, his brother immediately dialed the emergency dispatch line for the Whatcom County Sheriff Department and the National Park Service Search and Rescue Division. By 7 the following morning, September 24th, a massive, coordinated search operation was launched. Over 40 seasoned ground trackers, high-angle mountain rescue specialists, K-9 tracking teams from King County, and a high-altitude UH-72 Lakota helicopter equipped with forward-looking infrared thermal imaging cameras flooded the Fisher Creek drainage. The conditions for a search operation were practically ideal. There had been no fresh snowfall to obscure footprints, no high winds, and the river levels in the basin were running low and clear. For 7 continuous days, searchers thoroughly combed every single square yard of the trail, the surrounding talus slopes, the boulder fields, and the dense brush along the creek beds. They swept the entire 30-mile valley corridor 4 separate times, using specialized sonar equipment to scan deep glacial pools and lowering technical teams down into every crevasse and ravine within 2 miles of Julian's last known campsite. They found absolutely nothing. There were no dropped energy bar wrappers, no broken trekking poles, no scuff marks on the granite ledges, and the bloodhounds were unable to catch even a faint trace of human scent past the upper meadow where Julian had pitched his tent on September 22nd. His tent, his heavy sleeping quilt, his primary stove, and his spare clothing were all neatly packed away, meaning Julian had successfully broken camp on the morning of September 23rd and vanished into thin air somewhere along an open, well-defined 6-foot-wide dirt trail. After 9 days of exhaustive, round-the-clock searching that covered more than 120 square miles of backcountry wilderness, the official search operation was suspended on October 2, 2018. Julian Ward was officially classified as a missing person, his name added to the long, haunting list of individuals who had simply stepped into the dense forests of the Pacific Northwest and ceased to exist. For 3 continuous years, the case remained entirely dormant. The family held a memorial service, the trail registry logs were archived into county filing cabinets, and the wilderness of the North Cascades reclaimed the quiet valley. Then came the afternoon of the 14th of October, 2021. A 61-year-old retired United States Geological Survey hydrologist named Caleb Ross was conducting an independent, authorized soil and sediment survey near the base of Mount Triumph, a sheer 5,000-foot granite mass located approximately 14 miles northwest of where Julian had originally vanished. The area around Mount Triumph was designated as a Class 4 Technical Wilderness Zone, meaning it was completely devoid of maintained trails marked by nearly vertical rock faces, impassable slide alder thickets, and deep, unmapped subterranean drainage fissures carved out by ancient subterranean glacial runoff. Around 3 in the afternoon, Caleb was scrambling across a narrow, unmapped shelf of loose basalt scree roughly 800 feet above the valley floor, searching for an active groundwater seepage point. As he maneuvered around a massive, house-sized glacial erratic boulder that had been split in half by centuries of frost wedging, Caleb looked down into a narrow, vertical fissure in the rock face that measured barely 2 feet wide and descended 15 feet down into the dark, subterranean bedrock. Wedged tightly into the bottom of that freezing, pitch-black stone crevice, resting on a bed of dry gravel that had never seen direct sunlight, was a bright splash of faded color. Caleb clicked on his high-powered field inspection light, aiming the beam straight down into the narrow gap. Lying wedged between the cold basalt walls was a carbon frame backpack beside a pair of worn trail-running shoes and a faded cobalt blue windbreaker matching the exact gear Julian Ward had been wearing on the morning he disappeared 3 years earlier. Caleb immediately stepped back from the ledge, recorded his precise GPS coordinates, and hiked 3 hours back to his vehicle to alert the National Park Service rangers in Marblemount. The following morning, the 15th of October 2021, a technical high-angle recovery team, accompanied by Whatcom County Sheriff detectives and forensic specialists, arrived at the remote basalt shelf via helicopter. The recovery operation was agonizingly difficult. The vertical stone fissure was so narrow that only a single, slender rescue technician, suspended from a mechanical tripod hoist, could lower himself down into the crevice while wearing specialized breathing equipment. When the technician reached the bottom of the 15-foot stone void, he quickly secured the backpack, the shoes, and the clothing into forensic transport bags. Then, as the technician cleared away the loose gravel at the base of the crevice, he confirmed that Julian Ward's skeletal remains were resting beneath the stones, completely undisturbed by wildlife and fully intact. The recovery of the remains brought an immediate, overwhelming sense of closure to the long-standing cold case. The initial working theory seemed straightforward. Julian had somehow become disoriented on the morning of the 23rd of September 2018, wandered 14 miles off route into the technical terrain of Mount Triumph, lost his footing on the loose basalt scree, and tumbled down into the narrow fissure, where he tragically succumbed to the elements. However, as the forensic team and lead detectives began systematically cataloging the physical items recovered from the bottom of the crevice inside the Mobile Field Command Unit, a series of bizarre, inexplicable physical contradictions began to emerge that shattered the simple accident theory entirely. First was the location itself. To reach that specific basalt shelf on Mount Triumph from the Fisher Creek drainage, a hiker on foot would have had to cross 3 separate 9,000-foot mountain passes, navigate 2 impassable Class 5 technical rock faces that required specialized rope systems and ice axes, and swim across the freezing, torrential currents of the Baker River. It was a route that seasoned mountaineering experts calculated would have taken at least 5 to 6 days of extreme, non-stop physical exertion for a fully equipped mountaineer, let alone a lightweight trail runner carrying only 2 days of rations. Second was the condition of Julian's footwear and gear. The trail running shoes recovered from the bottom of the fissure showed zero wear on the rubber tread. The synthetic soles were pristine, the laces were tied in double knots, and the fabric was entirely free of the typical rock abrasions or mud accumulation that would have inevitably occurred during a grueling 14-mile trek across jagged scree fields. Third, and most unnerving, was Julian's personal belongings. Inside the zippered side pocket of the cobalt blue windbreaker, detectives found Julian's wallet, his untouched driver's license, his fully functional Garmin satellite communicator, and his water-resistant digital watch. The battery on the digital watch was still functioning on its long-life lithium cell. The automated internal calendar on the watch had recorded continuous, uninterrupted biological pulse telemetry data from the wrist sensor, storing the exact physiological timeline of the wearer directly onto its internal flash memory chip. The detectives plugged the digital watch into the forensic field terminal to extract the telemetry log and pinpoint the exact time and date Julian had passed away inside the crevice in late September 2018. The forensic software completed the data extraction, and the daily activity graphs loaded across the high-resolution laptop screen. The lead investigator leaned forward, his eyes scanning the digital timeline, and felt a cold, paralyzing shock settle deep into his chest. According to the uncorrupted, factory-calibrated internal sensor on the watch, Julian's heart rate had not stopped beating in late September of 2018. The biometric data showed that Julian's pulse had remained completely steady, active, and healthy through all of 2019, through all of 2020, and all through the spring and summer of 2021. The final, absolute flatline of his heart rate had been recorded by the watch sensor on the 10th of October 2021, just 4 days before Caleb Ross looked down into the rock crevice. And resting on top of the dry gravel directly beneath Julian's boots was a clean, modern plastic parking receipt stamped and printed from a commercial parking garage in downtown Seattle, carrying an automated timestamp from the 8th of October 2021 at 2:15 in the afternoon. The mobile command unit inside the Marble Mount Ranger Station fell dead silent. The lead investigator stared at the parking receipt in a sterile evidence bag, his hands shaking slightly against the metal table. The receipt was pristine. It was printed on heat-sensitive thermal paper from the Pacific Place garage on 6th Avenue in downtown Seattle. The ink had not degraded from months in the elements. It had been spit out by an automated terminal less than a week prior. Within 48 hours, the case transformed from a simple wilderness recovery into a massive multi-jurisdictional criminal inquiry involving the Seattle Police Department, the FBI, and the Washington State Patrol. Detectives pulled the municipal security camera feeds from the Pacific Place garage for the afternoon of the 8th of October 2021. At exactly 2:15, a dark gray commercial utility van entered the subterranean structure. The automated camera caught the driver pulling the parking ticket from the dispenser. The man behind the wheel was not Julian Ward. It was a 52-year-old former state park maintenance mechanic named Arthur Vance, who had been dishonorably discharged from government service in early 2019 following an internal investigation into missing master keys and unauthorized access to remote historical administrative cabins. Federal agents executed an emergency search warrant on a secluded, off-grid 5-acre homestead owned by Vance in the foothills outside Concrete, Washington, less than 20 miles from the Mount Triumph trailhead. When tactical units breached the subterranean concrete storm cellar behind Vance's property, the chilling truth behind the 3-year mystery was finally exposed. The underground storm cellar had been converted into a soundproofed, reinforced holding room containing dry food provisions, a single bed, and hundreds of forestry maps marked with remote, high-altitude topographical coordinates. In late September of 2018, Arthur Vance had been driving an unmarked park maintenance truck along a restricted logging service road that crossed the lower Fisher Creek drainage. He had encountered Julian Ward coming off the trail, offered him transport under the pretense of a severe washout ahead, and subdued him with a chemical tranquilizer once Julian entered the cab. For 3 years, Vance kept Julian locked in the isolated concrete shelter. He did not harm him physically, but Vance suffered from a severe, delusional fixation on wilderness survivalism and federal territorial control, believing he was protecting selected individuals from an impending societal collapse. He forced Julian to maintain a strict physical conditioning routine, allowing him to wear his digital fitness watch to track his vitals as part of his rigid, obsessive regimen. In early October of 2021, when local county tax assessors and environmental inspectors scheduled an on-site property boundary audit of Vance's homestead, Vance panicked. Realizing the bunker would be discovered, Vance administered a lethal dose of fast-acting barbiturates to Julian on the evening of October 9th. Knowing the search and rescue protocols of the North Cascades intimately from his decades as a park mechanic, Vance loaded Julian's body, along with his original backpack and untouched gear, into a heavy-duty transport frame. Using a private industrial service road and a decommissioned mining winch system that bypassed the impassable river crossings, Vance hauled the body up the backside of Mount Triumph under the cover of night, dropping Julian into the narrow, unmapped basalt crevice. He believed the deep fissure would remain hidden forever, or if ever found, the death would simply be dismissed as a tragic hiking accident from 2018. He had forgotten a single critical detail. When he picked up the utility van from a Seattle service garage 48 hours earlier, he had tossed the parking receipt onto the floorboard, and it had stuck to the tread of Julian's pristine shoes as he carried him into the crevice. Arthur Vance was arrested without incident at a truck stop outside Spokane while attempting to flee east into Idaho. In late 2022, he was convicted in federal district court on charges of aggravated kidnapping, unlawful imprisonment, and first-degree murder, receiving a sentence of life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Julian Ward was finally returned home to Bellingham, bringing an end to an impossible case that proved that the darkest mysteries of the wilderness sometimes have nothing to do with the woods at all, but with the human monsters hiding within them. In early October of 2017, a 45-year-old lead detective named Ryan Vance was stationed in the small, picturesque coastal town of Camden, Maine. Ryan had spent nearly 2 decades in law enforcement, handling everything from property disputes to seasonal tourist incidents across Knox County. Camden was the kind of idyllic New England harbor town where violent crime was virtually non-existent. People left their front doors unlocked, fishermen greeted shop owners by name along the rocky wharves, and the quiet rhythm of daily life was dictated largely by the changing tides and the arrival of autumn leaf peepers. However, that peace was shattered on the rainy night of the 24th of October 2017, when a prominent local maritime historian and antique book dealer named Gregory Vance vanished without a trace. Gregory was a 72-year-old widower who lived alone in a grand 3-story, cedar-shingled home perched on a granite bluff overlooking Penobscot Bay. He was a creature of absolute habit. Every morning at 7, he walked down to the Harbor Bakery for black coffee, spent his afternoons archiving historical coastal charts in his private study, and dined at the local tavern by 6. When Gregory failed to show up at his bookshop for 2 consecutive days, and his front door was found standing unlocked during a nor'easter, neighbors immediately dialed the Knox County Sheriff Department. Ryan Vance led the investigation from day 1. Inside Gregory's house, detectives found no signs of forced entry, no broken glass, and no indications of a physical struggle. Gregory's wallet, cell phone, passport, and vehicle were all left behind. The only anomaly was Gregory's motorized 22-foot wooden dory, which was missing from its private dock at the base of the granite bluff. 4 days into the massive search, the Coast Guard located the dory drifting aimlessly 12 miles offshore near the rocky shoals of Vinalhaven Island. The vessel was completely intact, the outboard engine was out of fuel, and the ignition key was turned to the run position. Inside the boat, investigators found Gregory's oilskin rain slicker neatly folded on the wooden bench, along with an open thermos of cold tea and a single handwritten note resting on the helm console. The note was brief, written in Gregory's distinctive, elegant fountain pen script. "The tide takes what it gives. I am tired of fighting the cold. Forgive me." Forensic handwriting analysis confirmed the script was a match to Gregory's personal journals. An extensive underwater sonar sweep of the surrounding oceanic trench yielded no body, but given the severe gale force currents, freezing water temperatures, and the clear suicidal note, the Maine State Police and the Knox County coroner officially declared Gregory Vance dead by suicide via drowning. The estate was closed, the antique bookshop was auctioned off to a commercial developer, and the case file was stamped closed, archived into the cold case drawer at the Camden Station by the spring of 2018. For 4 continuous years, the tragedy was treated as a settled, unfortunate chapter in the town's local history. Ryan Vance eventually transitioned from lead criminal investigator to managing administrative operations, watching new files replace the old. Then came the freezing morning of the 14th of November 2022. A brutal early winter blizzard had dumped 10 inches of heavy, wet snow across coastal Maine, knocking out power to several harbor neighborhoods and turning Route 1 into a sheet of gray slush. Ryan arrived at the police station around 7:30 in the morning, carrying a cardboard cup of coffee, shaking the snow from his wool coat. Sitting directly in the center of his desk was the morning mail delivery, sorted by the front desk clerk. Lying on top of the pile of municipal utility notices and interdepartmental memos was a thick, heavy cream-colored envelope sealed with a circular wax stamp of dark red paraffin. The envelope had no printed postage barcode, no postal cancellation mark, and no return address. It had been hand-delivered, slipped directly through the exterior drop slot of the Camden Police Department during the middle of the blizzard overnight. Written across the front of the envelope, in fresh, flowing black India ink, was Ryan's full name and rank, Detective Ryan Vance, Case File 2017-449. Ryan pulled off his gloves and stared at the handwriting. A strange, cold sensation settled in his stomach. The script was unmistakable. The sweeping loops of the capital letters, the precise slant of the vowels, and the sharp terminal strokes were the exact stylistic hallmarks of Gregory Vance, the man officially declared dead 4 years earlier. Ryan grabbed a metal letter opener from his desk drawer, carefully slicing along the top seam of the envelope without disturbing the wax seal. Inside was a single folded sheet of heavy cotton archival paper, accompanied by a small, rusted brass skeleton key measuring roughly 2 inches in length. Ryan unfolded the paper, smoothed it out across his desk under the fluorescent office lights, and read the letter. The ink was sharp, dark, and completely fresh, smelling faintly of linseed oil and mineral turpentine. The letter read, "Ryan, you looked for me in the deep water because the water was convenient. You read the note on the dory because the words gave you an easy conclusion. You closed the file because the living always prefer an orderly death over an unfinished puzzle." The dory was a decoy. The note was composed under instruction. "I am not beneath the waves of Penobscot Bay. I have not left the peninsula. For 1,847 days, I have been waiting beneath the foundations of the carriage house at 348 High Street. The brass key opens the lower iron grate behind the root cellar shelving. Come alone before the snow melts, or you will only find what the winter preserves." The letter was signed at the bottom, Gregory Vance, the 13th of November, 2022. Ryan sat motionless in his swivel chair, the quiet hum of the station heater suddenly sounding deafening. He read the words 3 times, his pulse quickening with every pass. 348 High Street was the address of Gregory's ancestral property on the bluff. Following the closure of the probate estate in 2019, the primary three-story house had been purchased by a wealthy family from New York as a summer vacation residence. However, the detached stone and timber carriage house at the rear of the property had remained completely boarded up, unused, and neglected due to severe historical structural preservation covenants. Ryan immediately called the state crime lab in Augusta, requesting an urgent, expedited chemical test on the ink and paper stock, while quietly notifying the on-duty patrol sergeant that he was conducting an immediate field follow-up on a reopened historical lead. He strapped on his service weapon, grabbed a heavy tactical flashlight, tossed a heavy crowbar into the back of his four-wheel drive department SUV, and drove out through the drifting snow toward the North Bluffs. The drive along High Street was slow and treacherous. The ocean below the cliffs was a churning mass of dark slate-gray water, throwing plumes of white spray against the jagged granite rocks. Ryan pulled up the long, unplowed gravel driveway of 348 High Street at approximately 9:15 in the morning. The main summer house was entirely shuttered for the winter season, its expansive windows covered with dark plywood storm panels. Behind the main residence, half hidden behind towering stands of white pine and frozen hemlock, stood the two-story carriage house. Its weathered cedar shingles were black with moisture, the roofline sagging under the weight of the fresh snow, and the heavy double wooden barn doors were secured with an old rusted chain and padlock. Ryan pulled his wool watch cap low over his ears, grabbed his flashlight and crowbar, and stepped out into the knee-deep snow. As he walked around the perimeter of the carriage house toward the rear foundation, he noticed something that made his heart skip a beat. In the fresh snow along the north wall, partially sheltered beneath the wide wooden eaves of the roof, was a distinct set of fresh, deep boot prints. The tracks were crisp, completely unmarred by the morning wind, leading directly toward an exterior wooden bulkhead door set into the fieldstone foundation. The wooden bulkhead doors, which had supposedly been nailed shut during the probate estate closure 4 years ago, were unlatched. The heavy iron hasp hung open, and the door was propped ajar by roughly 2 inches with a flat river stone. Ryan drew his department-issued Glock 22, holding the weapon in his right hand while gripping the tactical flashlight in his left. He used the toe of his heavy winter boot to nudge the bulkhead door open. The hinges screamed in protest, sending a sheet of crusty snow sliding down the wooden planks. A blast of bitterly cold, stale air escaped from the dark cellar void, carrying an overpowering smell of damp lime mortar, wet earth, and the distinct, unmistakable scent of burning paraffin wax. Ryan switched on his tactical light, aiming the wide, powerful beam down the steep flight of slippery wooden cellar steps. He descended slowly, step by deliberate step, his boots crunching over decades of accumulated grit and fallen plaster chips. When he reached the dirt floor of the cellar, he panned the light around the low-ceilinged space. The room was roughly 30 feet square, walled with heavy, unmortared fieldstone. Rows of rotting wooden shelves stood along the perimeter, filled with empty vintage mason jars, rusted gardening tools, and broken window sashes. Ryan walked toward the far back wall where the letter had indicated. Standing against the center fieldstone pier was a massive 6-foot-tall wooden storage shelving unit, completely loaded with discarded stacks of historical maritime journals and brittle nautical charts. Ryan placed his left hand against the frame of the heavy shelf and pulled. The entire unit swung outward smoothly on hidden, heavily greased steel caster wheels set into the dirt, revealing a dark, vertical opening behind the stone wall. Set directly into the granite foundation was a narrow, heavy cast-iron grate measuring 3 feet wide and 5 feet tall. In the center of the iron grate was an antique, heavy brass locking mechanism with a keyhole matching the exact shape of the rusted skeleton key resting inside Ryan's coat pocket. Ryan stepped forward, pulled the key from his pocket, and inserted it into the lock. The heavy brass tumblers turned with a sharp, heavy metallic clank that resonated through the subterranean foundation. Ryan pulled the iron grate outward. Behind the grate lay a narrow, dry-walled stone tunnel that descended at a gentle slope directly toward the edge of the granite bluff overlooking the sea. Positioned along the tunnel walls, every 10 feet were small, recessed alcoves holding burning wax candles, their small orange flames flickering gently in the draft. And resting on a rough wooden bench just 15 feet down the illuminated tunnel was a fresh, unopened envelope identical to the one delivered to the police station, pinned to the wood beneath a heavy, brass maritime chronometer whose mechanical balance wheel was ticking with loud, rhythmic precision in the dead silence. Ryan took 2 slow, calculated steps into the candlelit tunnel, his service weapon raised and locked in a 2-handed grip. The heavy, rhythmic ticking of the maritime chronometer filled the damp underground passageway, keeping time with the muffled roar of the Atlantic surf crashing against the granite cliffs outside. He reached the wooden bench, kept his eyes sweeping the flickering shadows ahead, and picked up the second envelope with his left hand. He slid his thumb under the flap, breaking the red wax seal. Inside was a single, folded nautical chart of Penobscot Bay, heavily marked with coordinates, along with a brief, handwritten instruction in that same unmistakable black ink. Keep walking to the observation bunker. He is waiting in the chair. Ryan continued down the stone-walled corridor. The air grew progressively colder, carrying a sharp, salty sea mist as the tunnel sloped toward the cliff face. 30 feet further, the passage opened into a vaulted, octagonal chamber built directly inside the natural sea cavern beneath the bluff, a forgotten World War II coastal defense observation post constructed in the early 1940s. A wide, horizontal, concrete observation slit looked directly out over the boiling gray waters of the bay. In the center of the chamber, illuminated by the cold, pale daylight filtering through the slit, sat an antique wooden armchair facing the ocean. Sitting upright in the chair was the figure of an elderly man, dressed in a heavy wool peacoat, dark canvas trousers, and leather boots, his head resting slightly back against the high wooden frame. Ryan moved forward cautiously, his flashlight beam pinning the figure in harsh white light. "Police! Keep your hands where I can see them!" There was no movement, no breath, no response. Ryan approached the side of the chair, his fingers pressing against the cold skin of the man's neck. There was no pulse. The man was Gregory Vance. His body was completely intact, frozen solid in the sub-freezing coastal air, preserved by the natural cold storage of the subterranean bunker. But forensic examination of his skin and the surrounding dust revealed something that defied all medical logic. Gregory had not passed away 5 years ago in 2017. He had died less than 48 hours earlier. Resting on Gregory's lap was a portable microcassette recorder wired with an external lapel microphone, alongside a thick spiral dossier stamped with property transfer deeds and banking records. Ryan clicked the playback button on the recorder. A raspy, labored voice, cracked with age and exhaustion, yet unmistakably that of Gregory Vance, began to speak through the small speaker. "Ryan, if you are hearing this, the final letter reached your desk in time. For 5 years, I did not live. I was kept down here. In October of 2017, I discovered that the developer managing the Municipal Harbor Reclamation Project was systematically liquidating protected coastal parcels through forged historical deeds. When I confronted him with the original colonial charters from my archive, he did not kill me. He knew that an unsolved murder would draw state police scrutiny and freeze the land titles in probate. He forced me to write that suicide note under duress, drove my dory out to Vinyl Haven to stage my drowning, and locked me in this bunker beneath the carriage house. He brought food once a week. He kept me alive only because my signature was required on staggered trust distributions that unlocked $30 million in commercial harbor assets over a 5-year vesting cycle. 2 nights ago, the final vesting period concluded. He brought the last document for me to sign, and he left me here without heat or provisions to let the winter finish the job. He did not know I had spent 40 months carving a loose stone out of the drainage flue to reach the upper carriage house, or that I had kept this archival paper hidden in the wall. I wrote the letter with the last of my strength and walked it to your station before the blizzard trapped me. Everything you need to convict him is in this dossier." The recording clicked off with a sharp mechanical snap. Ryan stood in the freezing bunker, his jaw clenched, staring at the detailed corporate ledgers resting on Gregory's knees. The developer, named throughout the documents, the man who had orchestrated the abduction, forged the historical land sales, and visited the hidden bunker under the cover of darkness for 5 years, was Marcus Sterling, a prominent Camden City Council member and the head of the Regional Planning Commission. Ryan called in immediate tactical backup. Within 2 hours, state police units surrounded Marcus Sterling's waterfront estate in Rockport, arresting him just as he was loading luggage into his vehicle to board an international flight out of Boston. Forensic units searching Sterling's home recovered the master keys to the carriage house bulkhead, matching carbon paper used to trace Gregory's signatures, and surveillance equipment used to monitor the Bluff property. The case that had sat stamped closed as a tragic suicide in 2017 was formally reopened and converted to charges of aggravated kidnapping, financial fraud, and first-degree murder. Marcus Sterling was convicted in Knox County Superior Court and sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Gregory Vance was finally laid to rest with full honors in the historic coastal cemetery overlooking the bay he had dedicated his life to preserving, closing the final, terrifying chapter of the mystery letter that refused to let the truth stay buried in the dark. In late October of 2019, two 30-year-old childhood friends and passionate landscape photographers, Logan Hayes and Connor Reed, decided to undertake a challenging, off-trail expedition deep into the heart of the Superstition Mountains, located just east of Phoenix, Arizona. Logan and Connor had spent over a decade exploring the most remote corners of the American Southwest, building a reputation for capturing stunning, untouched wilderness landscapes. They were deeply experienced, physically fit, and thoroughly familiar with the brutal realities of desert survival. The Superstition Mountains, however, carried a very different reputation. For over a century, the rugged range had been shrouded in dark local folklore. Tales of the legendary Lost Dutchman gold mine, sudden and inexplicable tragedies, and a long history of hikers mysteriously vanishing without a trace amid the labyrinthine canyons and towering volcanic cliffs. Despite the eerie legends, Logan and Connor viewed the trip as a standard autumn adventure. They packed top-tier camping gear, high-capacity water bladders, a satellite emergency messenger, and a professional-grade digital mirrorless camera equipped with multiple specialized lenses. On the morning of October 21, 2019, the two men parked their truck near the Peralta trailhead, shouldered their heavy 40-pound packs, and hiked past the established path, heading deeper into the trackless wilderness toward Needle Canyon. For the first 2 days, the expedition went flawlessly. The desert weather was crisp during the day and bitterly cold at night, offering brilliant blue skies and extraordinary photographic opportunities. They spent hours framing shots of the dramatic stone spires, the sprawling fields of cholla cacti, and the stark, beautiful desolation of the Arizona desert as it was painted in the golden hues of late afternoon. By the third day, October 24th, a sudden and unseasonal cold front swept down from the northern plateaus, bringing biting winds and dropping temperatures well below freezing as soon as the sun dipped behind the jagged ridgelines. The landscape changed instantly, trading its warm desert aesthetic for an austere, shadowy expanse of gray stone and dead silence. The two men made camp inside a narrow box canyon, pitching their tents on a flat shelf of sand beneath a towering, overhanging wall of dark volcanic rock. The canyon was claustrophobic, enclosed on 3 sides by sheer vertical cliffs that blocked out the horizon and created an unnatural, deadening acoustic dampening effect. As night fell over the Superstitions, the atmosphere inside the canyon shifted from peaceful solitude to something deeply oppressive. Around midnight, Connor was pulled from a restless sleep by a strange, sharp sound echoing against the stone walls high above their camp. It was not the howl of the desert wind, and it was not the skittering of wildlife across the rocks. It was a rhythmic, mechanical tapping sound, slow and deliberate, as though someone were striking a piece of heavy iron against the vertical rock face far above them. Connor lay inside his sleeping bag in total darkness, listening intently for several minutes, but the sound stopped as abruptly as it had begun. He convinced himself it was merely thermal contraction, the expanding and contracting of the rock cooling rapidly in the freezing night air, and eventually drifted back to sleep. The true nightmare began the following morning, October 25th, at approximately 6:30 in the morning. Connor unzipped his tent flap, stepped out into the freezing morning air, and called out to Logan. There was no response. Logan's tent was zipped shut from the outside. Connor walked over and unzipped the flap, expecting to find his friend sleeping in his thermal gear. The tent was completely empty. Logan's heavy expedition pack was sitting neatly in the corner. His primary water supply was untouched, and his rugged hiking boots were placed side by side near the tent entrance. But Logan was gone. Worse yet, Logan had left behind his heavy winter coat, his thermal gloves, and his satellite communicator. He had vanished into the sub-freezing desert dawn wearing only a thin fleece pullover, wool socks, and his lightweight hiking pants. Panic immediately set in. Connor spent the next 4 hours scrambling frantically across the boulder-strewn canyon floor, screaming Logan's name until his throat was raw, scouring every dry wash, crevice, and ledge within a half-mile radius. The canyon walls bounced his desperate shouts back in distorted, mocking echoes, but there was no sign of his friend, no footprints in the dry gravel, and no indication of which direction Logan could have possibly gone. Realizing he was entirely alone and out of his depth, Connor triggered the SOS distress signal on his satellite messenger. Within 4 hours, a rescue helicopter from the Pinal County Sheriff Department descended into the narrow box canyon, kicking up a violent vortex of dust and loose gravel. A team of seasoned mountain rescue deputies and search and rescue specialists rappelled down to the canyon floor, securing Connor and immediately initiating a wide-radius ground and air grid search. As the deputies swept the perimeter of the campsite, searching for any physical clue that could explain how a grown man could vanish without a trace from an enclosed box canyon, one of these search specialists spotted something glinting in the morning sun beneath a low rock ledge 50 yards downwash from the tents. It was Logan's professional mirrorless camera, the high-end device he had been using to document the entire expedition. The camera body was entirely intact, protected inside a rugged canvas holster, but its lens cap was missing, and the strap was frayed at one end as though it had been dropped or forcefully ripped from a shoulder. A rescue deputy picked up the camera, powered it on, and scrolled through the image gallery to see if the last captured frames could reveal where Logan had gone before his disappearance. The display lit up, displaying a chronological sequence of 76 photographs taken over the past 4 days. The deputies and Connor gathered around the small LCD screen, viewing the picturesque landscapes of Needle Canyon, the campsite shots from the previous evening, and the stunning sunset vistas captured just hours before Logan vanished. The deputies clicked through the final sequence of images, tracking the timestamp down to the late-night hours of October 24th, long after both men had gone to sleep in their respective tents. Photo number 74 showed a wide-angle, long-exposure shot of the night sky framed between the canyon walls, beautiful and completely undisturbed. Photo number 75 was taken at exactly 2:15 in the morning. The camera had been pulled from its protective case and pointed straight up from the canyon floor toward the dark, sheer overhang of volcanic rock directly above the campsite. Because it was a long exposure, the image was slightly grainy, but it clearly illuminated the sheer stone face rising 100 feet into the air. Clinging flat against the vertical rock wall, positioned directly above the ledge where Logan's tent had been pitched, was the distinct, pale silhouette of a human figure. The figure was pressed flush against the stone like a spider, with its limbs splayed out unnaturally wide. staring directly downward into the lens of the camera with dark, hollow voids where a face should have been. A heavy, suffocating silence descended upon the search team as they stared at the screen, the freezing desert wind whipping dust across their boots. Connor stared at the image in horror, his breath catching in his throat as he realized that the rhythmic tapping he had heard the night before had not been thermal rock contraction at all. With shaking hands, the rescue lead pressed the navigation button one final time to view the 76th and absolute final photo on the camera roll, taken just 3 seconds after the previous frame at 2:17 in the morning. The search lead pressed the small directional button, and the screen flashed white for a microsecond before loading the final frame. The image was drastically different from all the others. It was not a landscape, and it was not taken with a steady tripod. The shot was blurred by sudden, violent motion, framed at a steep, upward angle from inside the narrow opening of Logan's tent. The camera flash had fired directly into the pitch-black opening of the unzipped nylon door. Illuminated in the harsh, stark glare of the flash was a terrifyingly close perspective. Hovering just inches from the lens was a pair of heavy, oxidized steel climbing ascenders clamped tightly onto a braided black mountaineering rope that hung straight down from the rock ceiling above. And gripping those mechanical ascenders were 2 human hands, pale, heavily calloused, and covered in gray rock dust, reaching downward into the tent. The figure clinging to the cliff face was not a supernatural entity or a desert phantom. It was a man, equipped with specialized, blackened tactical climbing gear and a counterweighted haul system, descending silently from the summit of the sheer mesa above into the enclosed box canyon while the campers were fast asleep. The photo clearly captured the lower edge of the man's face just as the flash went off. Beneath a tight thermal balaclava, a heavy scar ran from his right ear down into his collarbone, and his eyes were locked in a wide, unblinking stare straight into the lens. Logan had not wandered off into the desert in his sleep. Logan had heard the tapping above, grabbed his camera to inspect the cliff, stepped back into his tent to review what he saw, and was confronted in absolute darkness the second the flash revealed the intruder descending into his shelter. Logan had been pulled straight up the vertical rock wall into the night. The sheriff deputies did not waste another second. They called in an immediate air support escalation, requesting tactical search teams and high-angle rope rescue units to sweep the inaccessible summit of the mesa overlooking Needle Canyon. Within 90 minutes, tactical teams rappelled onto the flat, windswept plateau directly above the campsite. Tucked away beneath a natural overhang of volcanic boulders, completely invisible from the canyon floor below, they discovered a sophisticated, long-term observation bivouac. The hide site contained military-grade spotting scopes, listening dishes aimed directly at the trails below, topographical maps marked with detailed notes, tracking hikers, and 3 empty equipment cases. And lying near the edge of the cliff, bound and suffering from severe hypothermia but miraculously alive, was Logan Hayes. Logan had been hauled up the 100-foot cliff face using a mechanical pulley system, restrained, and left in the freezing wind while his captor prepared to transport him deeper into the unmapped canyon networks of the Superstition Wilderness. The tactical team provided immediate field stabilization, wrapped Logan in thermal blankets, and evacuated him via helicopter to a trauma center in Mesa, where he was treated for exposure and severe shock. The search for the climber escalated into a massive federal and state manhunt across the rugged Arizona backcountry. 2 days later, law enforcement apprehended 47-year-old Wade Rourke hiding in an abandoned mining cabin near Fish Creek Canyon. When investigators cross-referenced Rourke's identity and fingerprints through federal databases, the shocking, chilling reality of the Superstition Mountains mystery came into full focus. Rourke was a former search and rescue mountaineer and extreme terrain specialist who had disappeared from Colorado 5 years earlier after being implicated in a series of remote trail ambushes. Using his intimate knowledge of technical climbing and the extreme geography of the Superstitions, Rourke had been living off the grid for years, occupying the unreachable upper ledges and cliffs above popular wilderness corridors. He had turned the historic legends of the mountains to his advantage, knowing that when hikers vanished in the superstitions, the public and search teams often attributed the disappearances to natural dehydration, disorientation, or supernatural folklore. For years, he had been stalking campers from hundreds of feet above, dropping down vertical cliff faces in the dead of night to harvest gear and target isolated travelers without leaving a single footprint on the canyon floor. The only reason his predatory pattern was broken, and the only reason Logan Hayes survived that freezing October night, was a single 3-second burst of an automated camera flash that captured the climber in the act. Wade Rourke was ultimately convicted in federal court on multiple counts of kidnapping, aggravated assault, and interstate criminal flight, and was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Logan and Connor returned to their lives, fully recovered in body, but neither man ever stepped foot into a narrow box canyon again, knowing with absolute certainty that the greatest danger in the wilderness does not always come from the ground beneath your feet, but from the darkness hanging silently above your head. In the early morning hours of the 17th of November 2022, a 36-year-old emergency communications specialist named Kendra Walsh was working the graveyard shift at the Regional Public Safety Answering Point in Flathead County, Montana. The Dispatch Communications Center was located inside a secure, subterranean concrete facility on the southern outskirts of Kalispell. It was a sterile, windowless room filled with the constant, low-frequency hum of server racks, the soft tapping of mechanical keyboards, and the glow of multi-monitor arrays displaying geographical mapping software, automated vehicle locators, and prioritized call queues. Kendra was an exceptionally experienced veteran dispatcher. Over 12 years on the console, she had processed thousands of emergency calls, ranging from catastrophic winter highway pileups along Highway 93 to backcountry wildlife encounters, structure fires, and high-tension domestic disturbances. She was known among her supervisors and the county sheriff deputies for her absolute composure under extreme stress. Kendra had a rare ability to keep her voice level, calm, and methodical, grounding hysterical callers and extracting vital tactical information when every second mattered. The night of November 16th, heading into the morning of the 17th, was unusually harsh. A fierce Pacific Northwest cold front had pushed over the Rocky Mountains, triggering a severe winter storm warning. By 2 in the morning, heavy sleet had turned into blinding, wind-driven snow, dumping nearly 10 inches across the valley floor and dropping ambient temperatures down to 11 degrees. Outside, the wind howled across the frozen timberlands, snapping pine branches and creating drifting conditions that slowed emergency vehicle response times to a crawl. Kendra was covering the primary emergency intake console alongside 2 other night shift dispatchers. Her personal life, much like her work life, was centered on quiet stability. Kendra lived alone in a restored, single-story craftsman bungalow on a secluded 2-acre wooded lot off Foothill Road, approximately 9 miles east of downtown Kalispell, nestled near the base of the Swan Mountain Range. The house was bordered by dense stands of western larch, lodgepole pine, and an expansive apple orchard that had grown wild and unmanaged for decades. Because her property sat far back from the main county road and had no immediate neighbors within sight, Kendra had invested in a comprehensive, hardwired smart home perimeter security setup, complete with heavy deadbolts, motion-activated floodlights, and battery-backed interior cameras that she could monitor directly from her smartphone. At exactly 3:14 in the morning, an incoming emergency line illuminated the center console with a sharp, pulsing red icon. The computerized telephony system flagged the call as coming from an unlisted, temporary VoIP cellular number with an unstable triangulation ping bouncing between 2 regional cellular towers in the East Valley foothills. Kendra pressed the intake button on her headset, adjusted her microphone, and delivered the standard, practiced opening. Flathead County 911. Where is your emergency? For the first 4 seconds, there was no verbal response over the line. All Kendra could hear was a faint, shallow breathing pattern, accompanied by a soft, rhythmic scratching sound that suggested the caller was holding the phone close to heavy canvas fabric. Kendra repeated the prompt, her voice firm and clear. 911, I have an open line. Can you tell me your location? Are you in danger? A voice finally responded. It was a woman's voice, but it was strained, raspy, and dropped to an agonizingly low whisper, trembling with sheer, visceral terror. Help me, please. The whisper came through the headset, cracking slightly. He cut the power to the circuit box outside. The whole place is dark. Kendra's hands immediately flew across her mechanical keyboard, entering the priority distress ticket, initiating an active cellular trace request to the service carrier, and flagging the on-duty patrol sergeant for the Eastern County sector. Ma'am, stay on the line with me, Kendra said, her tone steady and reassuring. I am getting help to you right now. Can you tell me your address or a nearby landmark? I don't know the house number, the caller whispered, her breath hitching as if she were hiding in a confined space. It is a rental out in the trees off the Foothill Road. I am trapped in the guest bedroom at the end of the hall. He is already inside the structure. Kendra's fingers paused on the keys for a split second. A cold, subtle prickle of unease ran down her forearms, but she instantly brushed it aside, focusing on her training protocols. Foothill Road was a long, winding, rural route with dozens of older homesteads, rental properties, and cabins scattered throughout the timber. Can you describe the layout of the property, ma'am? Kendra asked, typing rapidly. Where is the intruder right now? He walked up the long gravel driveway by the orchard, the caller whispered, the words coming in short, choked gasps. He bypassed the front porch with the fieldstone pillars and the green wooden bench. He went around to the rear mudroom where the cellar bulkhead is. Kendra sat entirely rigid in her high-backed ergonomic chair. Her heart gave a sharp, violent thud against her ribs. Fieldstone pillars, a green wooden bench on the front porch, a rear mudroom beside an exterior cellar bulkhead. That was not a generic description of a mountain rental property. That was the exact, unique architectural layout of Kendra's own house on Foothill Road. Kendra had personally built that green wooden bench from reclaimed cedar planks the previous summer, placing it between the two fieldstone pillars her father had laid 30 years earlier. Kendra felt a cold wave of disorientation wash over her, the sterile, brightly lit dispatch room suddenly feeling uncomfortably far away. She took a slow, deliberate breath, forcing her voice to remain entirely professional, though her throat felt tight. Ma'am, are you certain you are in a rental? Who is the owner of the property? I don't know. The caller breathed, her voice breaking into a suppressed sob. I was staying here. He followed me from the highway. Please, you have to hurry. He is wearing heavy rubber pack boots. He is walking across the oak floors in the living room right now. He just bumped into the cast iron coat rack by the grandfather clock. Kendra's blood ran completely cold. In Kendra's living room, positioned immediately beside the front entryway, stood an antique, heavy cast iron coat rack that sat directly adjacent to an 8-foot grandfather clock inherited from her grandmother. There was no mistake. The caller was not describing a similar house down the road. The caller was describing the interior of Kendra's private residence in real time, in the middle of a sub-zero winter blizzard. Kendra's hand trembled slightly as she reached across her desk, pulling her personal smartphone from its charging cradle. She unlocked the screen, opened her private security system application, and tapped the master dashboard. The mobile screen displayed a red banner across the top. System offline, primary AC power lost at 3:08 a.m. Battery backup active. The security cameras were running on low-power local storage, unable to broadcast live video feeds over the home's disabled Wi-Fi network. Kendra looked up at the large dispatch monitor, keying the priority emergency frequency to the patrol deputies on duty. All units, this is Dispatcher 4, Kendra stated, her voice tighter than usual, fighting to maintain her professional delivery. I have an active home invasion in progress at 4790 Foothill Road. Suspect is confirmed inside the residence. Caller is barricaded in the northwest guest bedroom. Suspect is mobile on the ground floor. Stage out with Code 3 response. The radio cracked back immediately as Deputy Marcus Cole acknowledged the transmission. Copy that. 4. Unit 12 is en route from Creston. Road conditions are heavy ice. Estimated arrival time is 8 to 10 minutes. 10 minutes. In an active home invasion, 10 minutes was an eternity. Kendra returned her full attention to the 911 audio channel, pressing her headset ear cup firmly against her ear. "Ma'am, I have deputies rolling to your location right now," Kendra whispered into her microphone, her voice carrying an intense, urgent gravity. "Listen to me very carefully. Is the guest bedroom door locked?" "Yes," the caller replied, her voice trembling so hard the words were barely audible. "But the latch is old. It's a skeleton key lock. It won't hold if he throws his weight against it." Kendra's chest tightened to the point of pain. The guest bedroom in her bungalow had an original 1920s mortise lock with an antique brass skeleton keyhole, a detail that nobody outside of her immediate family could possibly know. "Where are you hiding in that room?" Kendra asked, trying to visualize every corner of the bedroom. Inside the built-in cedar armoire, behind the extra winter quilts, the caller whispered. Kendra's mind raced. The built-in armoire was recessed directly into the wall framing of that room, deep enough for an adult to sit concealed behind the heavy wool blankets stored on the bottom shelf. "Can you hear where he is now?" Kendra asked. The caller went completely silent for several seconds. Through the line, the acoustic clarity of the call shifted. The background static seemed to drop away, replaced by the distinct, heavy sound of slow, unhurried footsteps dragging across hardwood floorboards. "Creak! Creak! Creak!" "He is in the hallway." The caller wept quietly. He stopped outside the bathroom. Now he is right outside the bedroom door. Kendra stared at the timer on her console screen. The call had been active for 4 minutes and 12 seconds. Deputy Cole was still at least 6 minutes away, fighting through the drifting snow on Foothill Road. "Ma'am," Kendra said, her voice dropping to a low, authoritative command. "If he breaches that door, do not stay in the armoire. The window behind the bed has a slide latch. You can drop onto the porch roof." The caller did not respond to the instruction. Instead, the sound of a heavy metal object scraping against wood came through the headset line, followed by the slow, distinct squeak of old brass hinges swinging open into an empty room. "He's in the bedroom." The caller breathed, the audio picking up the heavy, rhythmic breathing of a second person entering the space. "He is looking under the bed." Kendra felt tears of pure terror and adrenaline welling in her eyes, her knuckles white as she gripped the edge of the dispatch console. Then, over the open 911 audio feed, the heavy footsteps stopped completely. A long, suffocating silence hung over the line for 5 full seconds. Then, from the other end of the connection, the voice that spoke was no longer a trembling, frantic whisper from an unknown woman hiding in the closet. The voice was deep, slow, and completely calm, speaking with cold, chilling familiarity directly into the receiver, right from the center of Kendra's bedroom. "Hello, Kendra. You always told people on the radio that help was only minutes away. Let's see if your deputies get here before I check behind the quilts." Kendra did not freeze. The sound of that man's voice speaking her name inside her own home, mocking the very emergency system she had dedicated 12 years of her life to operating, triggered an immediate, cold clarity. There was no terrified victim trapped in the cedar armoire. The entire 911 call had been an elaborate, calculated lure staged by the intruder himself using a burner phone and a digital pitch modulator application to keep Kendra locked on the console, listening to her own violation in real time. Kendra did not reply over the line. She did not give him the satisfaction of hearing her panic. She kept the 911 channel open, pinned the audio monitor to the countywide emergency broadcast feed, and clicked her radio transmission button with a steady hand. "Unit 12, "This is Dispatcher 4, Kendra stated, her voice flat, sharp, and razor-focused. "Suspect is confirmed inside the structure, actively transmitting on the primary emergency queue. Suspect is armed, aware of your response, and holding in the northwest bedroom. Do not approach the front gravel lane. Approach on foot from the orchard along the south tree line. Breaching authorization granted immediately upon arrival." Deputy Marcus Cole keyed his radio instantly. "Copy that, 4. 2 minutes out. Turning off light bars at the intersection." Over the open phone line, the intruder chuckled softly into the receiver. The heavy sound of footsteps moved across the guest bedroom floorboards, heading toward the living room windows that faced the front lane. He was looking out into the blizzard, expecting the flashing red and blue strobes of approaching cruisers to give him ample warning. Because Kendra had routed the deputies through the unplowed orchard in total blackout mode, the intruder never saw them coming. At 3:23 in the morning, Deputy Cole and a second backup unit breached the rear mudroom door with a heavy battering ram, the oak frame splintering with a thunderous crack that echoed over the open dispatch headset. Deputies swept through the kitchen and hallway with weapon-mounted lights blazing, shouting commands, "Sheriff Department, get on the ground! Show your hands!" Over the 911 call audio, Kendra heard the sudden scuffle of heavy boots on the hardwood floor, a brief, violent struggle, and the loud clatter of a heavy steel crowbar hitting the floorboards, followed by the sharp, metallic ratcheting of handcuffs. Deputy Cole keyed his radio, breathing heavily. "Dispatch, suspect in custody. Scene is secure. House is clear." Kendra slowly released her grip on the desk, letting out a long, trembling breath as her colleagues in the dispatch room gathered around her console. When investigators processed the suspect and ran his identity through state and federal law enforcement databases, the chilling, obsessive reality behind the home invasion was brought to light. The man was 41-year-old Thomas Ray Sterling, a former volunteer auxiliary firefighter and tow truck operator who had been convicted of felony stalking and electronic harassment 5 years earlier in Missoula. Sterling had developed an unhealthy, fixation-driven obsession with Kendra's calm, authoritative voice after hearing her coordinate multiple complex highway rescue dispatches over the open public emergency scanner channels. He had spent over 6 months monitoring her shifts, tracking her vehicle from the dispatch facility, and mapping the perimeter of her secluded property on Foothill Road. Sterling had cut the main power box to disable the Wi-Fi cameras, used a stolen master key to enter through the cellar bulkhead, and placed the staged 911 call using a voice modulation tool specifically to force Kendra into handling the emergency herself, planning to ambuscade the deputies upon arrival and force a catastrophic standoff. Sterling was formally indicted in Flathead County District Court on charges of felony burglary, aggravated stalking, wiretapping, and reckless endangerment of emergency personnel. In mid-2023, he was convicted on all counts and sentenced to 35 years in the Montana State Prison in Deer Lodge without the possibility of early parole. Kendra took a 3-week administrative leave, reinforced her property with hardwired off-grid security systems, and returned to her dispatch console the following month. She continued to answer emergency calls with that same calm, unshakable composure, knowing better than anyone that when terror strikes in the dark, steady discipline and swift action are the only things standing between survival and disaster. In early October of 2022, a 38-year-old high school history teacher and seasoned backcountry bow hunter named Garrett Cole set out on a solo 7-day hunting expedition deep into the remote Lemhi Range of east-central Idaho. Garrett was a disciplined outdoorsman who had spent nearly 2 decades navigating the rugged, high-elevation wilderness areas of the Rocky Mountains. He possessed top-tier survival gear, a reliable composite hunting bow, an emergency satellite transponder, and a deep, practical respect for the unforgiving nature of the Idaho backcountry. The area Garrett selected was an isolated basin known as Big Creek Canyon, sitting nearly 30 miles south of the historic mining town of Salmon. The terrain was brutal, defined by jagged limestone crags, loose talus slopes, and dense ancient stands of Douglas fir, lodgepole pine, and quaking aspen that turned brilliant shades of gold in the early autumn. The high alpine valleys in this sector were largely untouched by modern infrastructure, cut only by a few overgrown, unmaintained forestry trails that had been abandoned by the United States Forest Service decades earlier. Garrett parked his heavy-duty four-wheel drive truck at an unpaved trailhead turnout along Highway 28 on the morning of October 4th. He strapped on his 60-pound external frame hunting pack, checked his gear, and began the grueling 12-mile hike up into the high alpine drainage, establishing a base camp at an elevation of roughly 8,000 feet near a clear glacial brook. For the first 4 days, the expedition went smoothly. The weather was clear, crisp, and cold, with midday temperatures hovering around 50 degrees before plunging down into the low 20s after sunset. Garrett spent his days glassing the timberline with his binoculars, tracking small herds of elk and mule deer through the dense timber, enjoying the profound, total silence that only the deep wilderness can provide. The shift in the expedition occurred on the afternoon of October 8th, around 3:30. Garrett was navigating a high, rocky saddle between two steep limestone ridges, searching for a vantage point over an unmapped northern drainage. As he reached the crest of the ridge, a sharp, distinct scent carried on the chilly mountain breeze caught his attention. It was not the pungent musk of an elk, nor was it the crisp scent of pine needles. It was the unmistakable, heavy smell of burning, cured hardwood and wood smoke. Garrett pulled his binoculars from his chest harness and scanned the deep valley below. Tucked into a heavily shadowed, narrow basin nearly 2 miles down the unmapped northern drainage, a thin, faint column of pale blue smoke was rising steadily into the afternoon sky, curling above the dense canopy of lodgepole pines. Garrett checked his updated United States Geological Survey topographical map. According to the official federal maps, the entire northern basin was designated as uninhabited public land, with no active mining claims, no permitted outfitter camps, and no maintained forestry roads within 20 miles. The only historical feature marked in the vicinity was a long-forgotten, late 19th century silver mining settlement called Copperhead Gulch, which had been completely abandoned in 1904 following a catastrophic winter avalanche and the collapse of the primary ore vein. Garrett assumed that an off-trail hunter, a lost backcountry hiker, or an illegal firewood harvester had established a temporary camp in the basin. With the sun already beginning to dip behind the western crags and temperatures expected to drop below freezing, Garrett decided to descend into the drainage to investigate the source of the fire. The descent into the basin was steep, treacherous, and choked with thick deadfall. As Garrett pushed through the dense stands of fir trees, the atmosphere grew increasingly cold and dim, the thick timber blocking out the remaining daylight. The forest floor was carpeted in a thick, spongy layer of dead moss and pine needles that completely absorbed the sound of his footsteps. At approximately 5:15, Garrett broke through the edge of the heavy timber and stepped onto a flat, gravelly terrace running parallel to a dry creek bed. Before him sat the weathered ruins of Copperhead Gulch. The town was an eerie, crumbling relic of the Old West. A dozen dilapidated, single-story pine timber buildings lined a single, unpaved central street that was now overgrown with wild ryegrass and sagebrush. The wooden structures were in various stages of advanced decay. Roofs had collapsed under decades of heavy winter snow loads, front porches hung crookedly from rotted foundation posts, and the faded, weathered wood had turned a dark, oxidized silver gray. The entire settlement was draped in total, unnatural silence. There were no bird calls, no wind rustling through the gables, and no sound of running water. Garrett kept his bow held low in his left hand, walking slowly down the center of the overgrown street, his boots kicking up faint puffs of pale dust. As he approached the center of the abandoned settlement, he noticed that the column of wood smoke was originating from the rusted iron chimney pipe of the largest intact structure, a two-story false front building that had once served as the town's general store and assay office. Garrett stopped in the middle of the street, 50 yards from the building, and called out into the dusk. "Hello? Anyone in the camp?" His voice echoed sharply against the surrounding limestone cliffs, fading into the cold mountain air without an answer. Garrett walked closer to the assay office, stepping onto the cracked wooden planks of the front porch deck. The structure appeared ancient and neglected, with boarded-up ground-floor windows and peeling tar paper along the eaves. However, as Garrett looked down at the threshold of the front entrance, a series of disturbing physical anomalies began to stand out against the decay. The heavy, rough-sawn pine front door was not weathered and cracked like the rest of the building. The timber was clean, freshly planed, and fitted with a brand-new, modern, heavy-duty cast steel rim lock secured with heavy brass screws that showed no signs of rust or patina. Directly in front of the door, the thick layer of pine dust and wild grass on the porch boards had been swept completely clean, and resting beside the doorframe was a neat, orderly stack of seasoned red fir firewood, chopped with clean, mechanical precision into identical 16-inch lengths, looking as though it had been split only hours earlier. Garrett reached out and lightly pressed his knuckles against the heavy pine door. The door was unlocked, swinging slowly inward on oiled, completely silent steel hinges that made no sound against the jamb. Garrett clicked on his high-powered tactical headlamp, illuminating the interior of the building. The scene that greeted him was completely contrary to the dilapidated exterior. The ground floor was not a rotted, hollow shell filled with rodent nests and broken timber. The interior walls had been completely rebuilt from the inside, with thick, modern plywood sheeting, insulated with layers of commercial fiberglass bats, and reinforced with heavy vertical steel studs. In the center of the main room sat a large, cast-iron, wood-burning stove, radiating intense, dry heat into the living space. Inside the stove's glass viewing window, bright red embers of split fir were actively glowing and crackling. Sitting on a clean, varnished timber dining table in the corner was a half-eaten meal, a porcelain bowl containing fresh venison stew, still steaming faintly into the warm room, beside a clean, unfolded cloth napkin and a stainless steel spoon. Across the room, arranged on sturdy metal industrial shelving units, were hundreds of organized, labeled glass mason jars containing preserved meats, dried root vegetables, and medicinal tinctures, alongside dozens of heavy-duty sealed plastic storage totes and stacks of commercial lithium battery power stations. There was no dust, there were no cobwebs, the room smelled of hot iron, savory stew, pine resin, and gun-cleaning solvent. Garrett felt a heavy, cold knot tighten in his gut. Copperhead Gulch was not an abandoned historic ghost town. It was an active, heavily stocked, and fully concealed off-grid compound operating in complete secrecy within the federal wilderness. Garrett backed slowly toward the open doorway, intending to leave the basin immediately, return to his high camp, and contact the Lemhi County Sheriff via his satellite beacon. As he reached the threshold of the porch, his eyes caught a large, laminated forestry map pinned to the wall beside the front door. Garrett stopped, shining his headlamp beam across the surface of the map. The map depicted the entire Big Creek drainage in high-resolution topographical detail. Marked across the paper in dark red wax pencil were several dozen detailed tactical waypoints, tracking lines, and observation notes. Garrett leaned closer, his pulse suddenly spiking. One of the red circles on the map was drawn around the exact coordinates of his own base camp up on the high glacial brook. Written beside the circle in neat block handwriting were the words, "Solo Hunter, arrived October 4th, Green Dome Tent, Compound Bow, heading north across the saddle today at 14. Garrett's blood turned to ice. Whoever was living in this hidden compound had not simply spotted him by chance. They had been actively stalking him through the timber, watching his campsite from the ridgeline, tracking his daily hunting patterns, and predicting his movements with terrifying accuracy. Garrett stepped out onto the porch, his hand shaking as he reached for the emergency SOS toggle on his satellite device clipped to his shoulder harness. Before his fingers could flip the protective plastic cover, a low, mechanical metallic click broke the stillness of the mountain air from the darkness of the street outside. Garrett froze. Standing 40 yards away in the center of the overgrown dirt street, partially concealed within the long shadows cast by the collapsing livery stable, was a tall, heavily built figure dressed in head-to-toe drab green canvas mountaineering gear. The figure was standing completely motionless in the twilight, holding a scoped bolt-action rifle raised to its shoulder, the dark barrel pointed directly at Garrett's chest. And from behind the rotting timber walls of the surrounding abandoned buildings from the livery stable, the collapsed saloon, and the old blacksmith shop, the distinct, heavy sounds of multiple boots crunching slowly across the gravel began closing in from every side. Garrett did not freeze, nor did he reach for his composite bow. His extensive wilderness survival training kicked in with absolute, razor-sharp clarity. He knew that in a standoff against a high-caliber scoped rifle at 40 yards, with multiple armed hostiles closing in from concealed flanks, reaching for a weapon meant immediate death. Instead, Garrett kept his hands held high, fingers spread wide away from his torso. With a swift, practiced movement of his left thumb against his chest harness, he flipped the hard plastic safety switch and mashed the emergency SOS toggle on his Garmin satellite transponder, transmitting an encrypted, high-priority distress beacon containing his exact real-time GPS coordinates directly to the International Emergency Response Coordination Center. The man in the drab green canvas coat stepped forward, his rifle remaining locked on Garrett's center mass. Two other armed men emerged from the shadows of the collapsed livery, stable, and the saloon, their faces obscured by wool balaclavas, moving with strict, disciplined tactical spacing. They disarmed Garrett of his bow, stripped his heavy pack, and confiscated his gear, but, in the fading dusk light, they completely overlooked the small, black satellite transponder blinking silently on his shoulder strap, assuming it was a standard avalanche beacon. Garrett was escorted at gunpoint into the reinforced basement beneath the assay office, a subterranean stone cellar that had been retrofitted with steel security doors, commercial off-grid communications gear, and high-frequency radio repeaters. Over the next 4 hours, Garrett learned the terrifying nature of the men who had seized Copperhead Gulch. They were not survivalist hobbyists or simple squatters. The group was part of a heavily armed, off-grid radical militia splinter cell led by a former private military contractor named Vance Halloway, who had vanished from northern Montana 2 years prior following federal indictments for firearms, trafficking, and conspiracy. Halloway and his core operatives had spent 24 months turning the forgotten ghost town into a covert, forward-operating sanctuary, utilizing unmapped subterranean silver mine adits for storage, and relying on the historical town's rotting exteriors to maintain complete aerial camouflage from federal satellite sweeps. They monitored the surrounding mountain passes with high-powered spotting scopes and remote trail sensors. When Garrett had pitched his Green Dome tent 4 days earlier, Halloway's group marked him as a potential threat to their operational security, planning to quietly eliminate him in the high saddle before he could ever discover the town. They never expected Garrett to spot the wood smoke and descend directly into the gulch on his own. Halloway had just begun interrogating Garrett regarding how much of the basin he had mapped when the night sky over Copperhead Gulch erupted in deafening thunder. Because Garrett had activated the satellite SOS beacon with confirmed coordinate locks, the response was swift and overwhelming. The Lemhi County Sheriff, the Idaho State Police Tactical Team, and an elite federal hostage rescue team deployed aboard 2 Black Hawk helicopters, navigating the rugged canyon under total blackout conditions with night vision systems. High-intensity floodlights turned the dark, overgrown street of the ghost town into stark daylight, as tactical operators dropped into the clearing with weapons blazing, surrounding the assay office and sealing off the mining adits. Caught entirely off guard and outmatched by federal air and ground assets, Holloway and his three conspirators surrendered within 20 minutes without a single shot fired. Federal law enforcement executed a week-long sweep of Copperhead Gulch, uncovering vast subterranean caches of unauthorized military-grade weaponry, tactical body armor, communications interception gear, and thousands of rounds of ammunition stored deep inside the old silver mine tunnels. Vance Holloway and his operatives were indicted in United States District Court for the District of Idaho on multiple federal counts, including treasonous conspiracy, illegal possession of restricted firearms, aggravated kidnapping, and unlawful establishment of an armed compound on federal public lands. In late 2023, Holloway was convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole at ADX Florence. Garrett Cole was safely extracted from the canyon, returning home to his family with minor bruises and an extraordinary survival story. The United States Forest Service and federal land authorities subsequently leveled the remaining structures of Copperhead Gulch with controlled explosives, sealing the underground mine shafts with reinforced concrete to ensure the ghost town could never hide another living soul. Garrett continued to teach and explore the backcountry, but whenever he caught the faint scent of wood smoke drifting on a cold mountain breeze, he never followed it into the trees again. In late October of 2021, a married couple in their early 30s, Ethan and Maya Caldwell, closed on an idyllic two-story Tudor-style rental home in the quiet, wooded suburbs of Lake Forest, Illinois. Ethan was an independent risk analyst for an insurance firm in Chicago, while Maya worked remotely as a botanical illustrator for regional academic journals. With the birth of their first child expected in the coming spring, they were desperate to trade their congested urban loft for space, tranquility, and a large yard. The house sat at the dead end of a winding residential lane lined with towering black walnut trees and dense thickets of buckthorn. Built in the late 1930s, the structure possessed magnificent leaded glass casement windows, original dark oak timbering, and a steep gabled roofline that looked straight out of a classic architectural magazine. The landlord, an elderly real estate investor who spent his winters in Florida, had offered the lease at a substantial discount, citing the older boiler heating system and the minor maintenance requirements typical of historic Midwestern homes. For the first few weeks, the Caldwells felt an overwhelming sense of domestic peace. The house was drafty, but Ethan kept the brick fireplace roaring in the living room every evening. Upstairs, they set up their master bedroom, an open-concept art studio for Maya, and a nursery that Ethan was actively painting in warm, pale yellow tones. The air throughout the house smelled of beeswax polish, dry oak lath, and wood ash, a nostalgic, comforting scent that made the property feel safe. However, as November arrived and the first bitter sleet storms swept across Lake Michigan, an irritating disturbance surfaced along the second-floor ceiling. It began on the night of November 12th, around 1:15 in the morning. Ethan was lying awake in bed, reading financial reports on his tablet, when a faint, dry sound emerged from the ceiling corner directly above Maya's side of the bed. It was a light, erratic scratching, accompanied by the muffled scuttle of tiny claws moving across dry plaster. Ethan nudged Maya awake, but by the time she opened her eyes, the sound had faded into the silence of the night. Ethan smiled, reassuring his wife that the cold weather was simply driving field mice or black roof rats into the eaves of the attic to nest near the warm chimney stack. Having grown up in rural Wisconsin, Ethan was well acquainted with the seasonal habits of woodland rodents. The next morning, Ethan drove down to the local hardware store on Western Avenue and purchased half a dozen heavy-duty snap traps, several boxes of rodent bait blocks, and 2 cans of expanding polyurethane foam. He pulled down the attic access ladder located in the hallway closet, poked his head into the dark, dusty crawl space, and scattered the baited traps across the exposed fiberglass insulation, making sure to seal a few small gaps along the exterior soffits. For 3 days, the scratching stopped completely, and Ethan congratulated himself on solving the problem quickly. Then, on the freezing night of November 19th, the scratching returned with an unsettling intensity. Around 2:30 in the morning, Maya sat bolt upright in bed, gasping as a loud, rhythmic, rasping sound echoed directly behind the drywall of the nursery next door. It did not sound like the frantic, light skittering of a quarter-pound field mouse. It was slow, heavy, and deliberate, sounding like a blunt nail or a thick wire being dragged rhythmically along the wooden lath strips. Ethan got out of bed, grabbed a heavy metal flashlight, and walked into the unfinished nursery. He pressed his ear flat against the yellow plaster wall. Beneath the paint, he could distinctly hear something moving inside the partition cavity. But what chilled Ethan was the cadence. The scratching would scrape 5 times, pause for exactly 3 seconds, and then scrape 5 times again, repeating with mechanical, almost rhythmic precision. Ethan tapped hard on the drywall with his knuckles to scare whatever creature was inside. The moment his knuckles struck the plaster, the wall tapped back. 3 sharp, heavy raps from inside the hollow cavity, directly level with Ethan's chest. Ethan stepped backward, his heart leaping into his throat. He tried to convince himself that a trapped raccoon or a large opossum had crawled down from the attic and was simply reacting in defense against the wall framing. The following afternoon, Ethan called a local licensed wildlife removal specialist named Carl Hatcher to conduct a comprehensive structural sweep of the attic, chimney, and perimeter foundations. Carl was a veteran exterminator with 30 years of experience handling animal intrusions across the North Shore. He arrived in a white utility van, strapped on heavy leather gloves, grabbed an industrial inspection borescope camera, and spent nearly 3 hours scouring the property from top to bottom. When Carl climbed down from the hallway ceiling hatch, he pulled off his dust mask and looked at Ethan with an expression of complete professional bewilderment. Carl explained that there was not a single trace of rodent or raccoon activity anywhere in the attic. There were no droppings, no shredded insulation nests, no chewed electrical wiring, and every single snap trap Ethan had laid out was still fully set with the bait completely untouched. Furthermore, the borescope camera showed that all exterior chimney flashing and roof vents were completely sealed with heavy galvanized wire mesh, making it physically impossible for any wild animal larger than an insect to penetrate the roofline. Carl packed his gear, shook his head, and suggested that perhaps the old cast iron steam pipes inside the radiator system were expanding and contracting against the wooden floor joists as the boiler cycled on and off, creating a scraping resonance that mimicked animal movement. Ethan desperately wanted to believe the steam pipe theory. But over the following 2 weeks, from late November into early December 2021, the atmosphere inside the Lake Forest house deteriorated into pure psychological dread. Small, unsettling occurrences began to manifest around the living quarters. Maya would find the kitchen pantry door unlatched and standing slightly ajar in the mornings, despite having secured it the night before. A small silver baby rattle, a gift from Maya's mother sitting on the nursery dresser, vanished without a trace, only to turn up 3 days later, sitting upright on the bottom step of the basement stairs. Maya became convinced that the house was afflicted by something unnatural. She began suffering from severe insomnia, terrified of the oppressive, heavy silence that settled over the second floor whenever Ethan was downstairs. She repeatedly told Ethan that whenever she sat in the nursery painting her botanical studies during the afternoon, she could feel a cold, faint draft brushing across her ankles, accompanied by the distinct, sickening smell of wet, sour wool and old copper. The climax of the terror occurred on the stormy night of the 14th of December 2021. A violent winter blizzard swept across Lake County, bringing sustained gale force winds, blinding snowfall, and freezing rain that snapped tree branches and knocked out municipal power across the entire neighborhood around 10 in the evening. The house plunged into pitch blackness, the radiators groaning as the electric boiler shut down, causing the interior temperature to plummet rapidly into the high 40s. Ethan lit several thick candles, placed them in ceramic bowls around the master bedroom, and urged Maya to bundle under several heavy down comforters to stay warm. Around 3 in the morning, Ethan was awoken by a sound that made every hair on his arms stand on end. It was not the wind howling against the gables. It was that same dry, abrasive scratching sound. But this time, it was not muffled behind lath and plaster. It was completely open, loud, and immediate, originating from directly beneath their heavy wooden bed frame. Scratch, 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 pause, scratch, scratch, scratch. Ethan lay entirely frozen under the blankets, his eyes wide in the dim, flickering orange candlelight. Maya was asleep beside him, her breathing soft and rhythmic. Ethan slowly slid his hand toward the edge of the mattress, reaching down to where his heavy tactical flashlight sat on the nightstand. His fingers curled around the knurled metal barrel. He clicked the tail switch, sending a blinding white LED beam cutting across the dark bedroom. Ethan took a deep, silent breath, rolled toward the edge of the mattress, and lowered the flashlight over the side, shining the high-powered beam directly into the dark void beneath the bed frame. The space beneath the bed was empty. There were only 2 plastic underbed storage bins and a pair of Maya's fleece slippers. Ethan let out a long, trembling breath of relief, resting his forehead against the wooden bedrail. Then, right at the edge of his peripheral vision, something caught his eye against the dark oak floorboards. In the center of the hardwood floor directly beneath the bed, the antique floral area rug had been shifted back by several inches, exposing a section of bare floorboards that Ethan had never seen before. Set flush into the oak planks was an old, rectangular cold air return iron vent grate, measuring roughly 12 inches wide by 24 inches long. The 4 heavy, flathead steel screws that secured the cast iron decorative grate to the floor framing had been cleanly extracted, sitting neatly in a small, organized row on the polished wood beside the opening. And resting right inside the dark galvanized ductwork shaft directly beneath the removed grate was a small, familiar silver object glinting in the LED light, the missing baby rattle. Ethan felt a surge of pure adrenaline freeze his blood. He leaned down lower, pointing the flashlight directly down into the vertical cold air return duct that dropped straight through the interior wall cavity toward the basement furnace trunk lines below. The beam of light traveled down the metal shaft, illuminating a series of small, custom-welded steel climbing rungs that had been anchored directly into the sheet metal walls of the ductwork at 12-inch intervals. And looking up from the dark bend of the duct shaft, 15 feet down inside the central heating core of the house, Ethan saw a pair of human hands, pale, heavily calloused, with fingernails worn down to raw, ragged edges gripping the metal rungs, accompanied by the slow, raspy sound of human breath echoing upward through the vents. Ethan did not scream. He did not freeze. The primal urge to protect his pregnant wife and unborn child took over his entire body in a fraction of a second. Ethan dropped the flashlight onto the rug, grabbed the heavy, solid oak nightstand with both hands, and flipped the 100-pound piece of furniture upside down directly over the open duct vent, slamming the heavy timber down against the iron framing with a concussive crash. From inside the duct shaft, directly beneath the oak wood, a frantic, muffled scraping erupted, followed by 2 violent, concussive thuds against the underside of the floorboards as whoever was climbing the metal rungs slammed their fists upward against the barricade. Ethan leaped onto the bed, shook Maya violently awake, and yelled at her to get up immediately. Maya opened her eyes in a terrified panic, seeing the sheer, wild terror on her husband's face. Ethan grabbed her winter coat, threw it over her shoulders, dragged her out of the master bedroom, and bolted down the dark second-floor hallway. They took the stairs 3 at a time, burst out through the front entryway into the freezing blizzard, and ran straight across the knee-deep snow toward Ethan's all-wheel drive SUV parked in the driveway. Ethan slammed Maya into the passenger seat, jumped behind the wheel, locked all four doors, and hit the ignition. He threw the transmission into reverse, spun the tires through the heavy slush, and tore down the residential lane onto Western Avenue, screaming into his phone as he dialed 911. Within 12 minutes, 5 squad cars from the Lake Forest Police Department and the Lake County Sheriff Department arrived at the dead-end lane, surrounding the Tudor residence with high-powered searchlights and weapons drawn. Tactical officers breached the front door, sweeping through the dark ground floor before advancing upstairs to secure the master bedroom. The overturned nightstand remained firmly in place over the open-air vent, but the sounds from beneath had stopped entirely. Officers moved the nightstand and lowered a fiber-optic tactical camera down into the galvanized return shaft. The duct was empty, but the custom-welded steel climbing rungs extended all the way down through the core of the house, leading directly into the main mechanical plenum above the decommissioned 1930s coal furnace in the deepest section of the stone basement. Tactical teams descended into the basement, clearing through rows of old timber framing and disused coal bins. Inside the cavernous, hollow sheet metal interior of the old industrial heating furnace, officers uncovered a fully functional, insulated living habitat. The interior of the vintage furnace had been lined with layers of acoustic foam and wool blankets. Inside was a sleeping cot, an unlit propane camping heater, dozens of opened ration cans, a pair of night vision binoculars, and a battery-powered shortwave scanner tuned directly to the local emergency police frequencies. Pinned to the metal walls of the furnace were dozens of detailed, hand-drawn blueprints of the house's entire internal structural cavities, along with handwritten observation charts detailing Ethan and Maya's daily schedules, their sleep cycles, and the projected due date of their baby. An exterior basement coal chute window was found kicked open from the inside, leading out into the dark woods behind the property. K9 tracking teams swept through the snow-covered buckthorn thickets, tracking a fresh scent trail through the blizzard to a detached private carriage house 3 doors down the lane. There, hiding in the unheated loft above a private garage, police arrested 42-year-old Warren Gable. When investigators ran Gable's fingerprints and history through regional databases, the terrifying, unbelievable truth of the Lake Forest house came into full focus. Warren Gable was the estranged adult son of the elderly property owner who spent his winters in Florida. Warren was a licensed HVAC technician and metal fabricator who had lived in the house as a child. When his father began leasing out the property to rotating tenants years prior, Warren refused to let go of the family estate. Using his professional knowledge of structural heating systems, Warren had systematically modified the massive, disused gravity-fed heating trunk lines during a previous vacancy, welding internal ladders, and carving access panels behind baseboard grates to turn the entire interior wall network into a private, hidden transit system. He did not live in the house full-time. He used his father's spare keys to slip into the basement during the winter months, living inside the furnace and moving through the ductwork while tenants slept above him. The scratching sounds that had terrorized Ethan and Maya for weeks had not been rats, mice, or expanding steam pipes. They were the sounds of Warren Gable slowly and methodically unscrewing the ventilation grates from the inside using a small flathead pocket tool, testing how far he could extend his upper body into the living quarters without alerting the residents. The rhythmic tapping Ethan had heard in the nursery had been Warren tapping his tool against the tin duct to measure the sound resonance of the empty room. Warren Gable was charged and convicted in Lake County Circuit Court on multiple felony counts of home invasion, stalking, residential burglary, and criminal trespass, receiving a 20-year sentence in state prison. Ethan and Maya broke their lease immediately, moved into a modern, single-story ranch home in southern Wisconsin, and welcomed a healthy baby girl the following spring. Ethan had every single heating vent in their new home inspected, reinforced, and bolted with tamper-proof security steel, knowing firsthand that the terrifying sounds in the walls are sometimes not animals at all, but a human being watching you from the dark. In the summer of 2021, a young married couple, Brian and Elena Whitmore, along with their 7-year-old son Lucas, decided it was time to leave their cramped suburban townhouse in Columbus, Ohio. Brian was a structural design technician who had recently transitioned into full-time remote consulting, and Elena worked as an online curriculum developer for high school science programs. Because both of their careers were now fully digital, they no longer needed to endure the daily highway commute or the crowded neighborhoods of the city. They wanted space, fresh air, and a place with historic character where Lucas could grow up exploring a large backyard. After months of browsing real estate listings across the state, they came across a striking property in rural Knox County, just outside the quiet town of Mount Vernon. It was a sprawling, 2-story farmhouse built in the late 1920s, resting on a gentle, grassy hill surrounded by 5 acres of rolling pasture and thick walnut trees. The house had high ceilings, heavy oak doors, a wide wraparound porch, and a deep stone cellar that stayed naturally cool even during the peak of summer humidity. The previous owner, a retired dairy farmer, had passed away nearly 2 years earlier, leaving the estate to distant relatives who were eager to sell quickly at an attractive price. Brian and Elena toured the property in early July, fell in love with its timeless aesthetic, and closed on the sale by the middle of August. Moving day was hot and exhausting, but as the Whitmore family unpacked their boxes and arranged their furniture across the hardwood floors, they felt an overwhelming sense of accomplishment. They believed they had found their permanent sanctuary. However, almost immediately after settling in, subtle and deeply peculiar things began to occur throughout the house. The initial anomalies started in late September 2021 when the autumn temperatures began to drop and the nights grew noticeably longer. Elena was the first to notice something out of the ordinary. She would come down to the kitchen in the early morning to prepare breakfast for Lucas, only to find several of the upper cabinet doors standing completely wide open. At first, she simply assumed that Brian had gone downstairs for a midnight glass of water and neglected to close them properly. But when she asked him about it over coffee, Brian looked confused, insisting that he had slept through the night and had not set foot in the kitchen since dinner. A week later, the disturbances escalated. Lucas began waking up between 2 and 3 in the morning, complaining of what he described as heavy scratching sounds coming from inside the drywall right beside his bed. Brian, being practical and experienced with older structures, assumed that a family of field mice, raccoons, or squirrels had found an entry point through the exterior cedar siding as the weather turned cold. He climbed a ladder outside, inspected the eaves, patched a few small gaps along the roofline, and placed several humane traps in the basement and along the crawlspaces. Yet, the traps remained completely empty for weeks, and the scratching noises persisted, growing louder and shifting from room to room with an unnerving irregularity. By November, the atmosphere inside the farmhouse took a distinctly ominous turn. The entire family began to experience an overwhelming sensation of heavy air, accompanied by an intense feeling of being watched whenever they were alone in certain sections of the house. Elena would be sitting at the dining room table working on her laptop in the middle of the afternoon, only to feel a sudden, freezing draft brush pass the back of her neck, despite all the double-hung windows being firmly locked and sealed. Whenever she turned around, expecting to see Brian or Lucas walking into the room, the hallway would be entirely empty, bathed in dead silence. Then came the physical disturbances that became impossible to rationalize through drafty windows or settling timbers. One Saturday evening in early December, while the family was sitting together in the living room watching a movie, a heavy ceramic vase sitting squarely on the fireplace mantel suddenly tipped forward and crashed onto the brick hearth, shattering into dozens of sharp fragments. Neither Brian, Elena, nor Lucas was within 10 feet of the mantel. Brian immediately stood up and examined the wooden shelf, checking with a level to see if the brickwork had shifted, but the wood was perfectly flat and secure. There had been no truck passing on the gravel road outside, and no physical vibration had traveled through the floorboards. A few nights later, Elena woke up around 3:30 in the morning to the distinct metallic sound of the heavy front door deadbolt clicking open, followed by the slow groan of the front door swinging outward on its brass hinges. Elena nudged Brian awake, her voice trembling in the dark. Brian grabbed a solid wooden baseball bat from the closet and crept down the stairs, every nerve on high alert, expecting to confront an intruder. When he reached the ground floor, he found the heavy front door wide open, allowing freezing winter wind and blowing snow to drift directly onto the entryway rug. The outside temperature was 22 degrees. Brian quickly searched the entire downstairs with a flashlight, checked the locks on all the windows, and stepped out onto the front porch to inspect the freshly fallen snow. To his utter bewilderment, there were no footprints in the snow on the porch steps, no tire tracks in the driveway, and no sign of forced entry anywhere on the frame. The deadbolt had simply been turned from the inside. Over the next 2 months, from January through February of 2022, life inside the Knox County farmhouse became an absolute psychological nightmare for the Whitmores. The incidents grew relentlessly frequent and increasingly aggressive. Objects would vanish from countertops and turn up days later, placed neatly on the basement stairs or hidden behind the living room sofa. Lucas refused to sleep in his bedroom, weeping in terror because he claimed he could hear a low, wet breathing sound coming from the small vintage air intake vent near the baseboard of his closet. Elena, who had always been deeply rational and skeptical of the paranormal, began to search local library archives and historic records online, looking into the history of the property to see if any tragedies, violent crimes, or untimely deaths had occurred on the land over the past century. She genuinely believed that the house was afflicted by some form of restless spirit or paranormal entity. The sheer impossibility of the physical events, doors unlocking themselves, objects shifting positions without human contact, and the cold drafts that seemed to follow them from room to room left her with no other logical framework. Brian, though desperately trying to remain the calm pillar of the household, was losing his own grip on composure. He installed battery-powered digital security cameras in the living room and the kitchen to capture evidence of what was happening. Yet, every time a bizarre occurrence took place, the cameras either suffered sudden, unexplained battery drains, or their recording lenses were found tilted upward toward the ceiling, as though someone had deliberately pushed them out of alignment while the family slept. The breaking point arrived on the stormy night of the 19th of March, 2022. A severe spring thunderstorm rolled across Knox County, bringing torrential rain, high winds, and heavy lightning strikes that knocked out the main electrical transformer down the road, plunging the entire area into complete darkness around 9 in the evening. Brian lit several candles and placed them around the kitchen and living room, while Elena sat with Lucas on the sofa, trying to keep the frightened boy calm as thunder rattled the window panes. Around midnight, exhausted from the tension and the oppressive dark, the family decided to go up to bed together in the primary bedroom, keeping the door locked and a candle burning on the nightstand. At approximately 2:45 in the morning, Brian was awakened by a strange, continuous sound that cut through the sound of the rain outside. It was not the wind, and it was not settling wood. It was the faint, rhythmic sound of running water coming from the ground floor. Brian sat up in bed, reached for his heavy metalwork flashlight, and quietly unlocked the bedroom door. He told Elena to stay in bed with Lucas and keep the door locked behind him. He stepped out into the dark upper hallway, switched on the flashlight, and began walking down the wooden staircase, each step creaking softly under his socks. The air in the stairwell felt unusually heavy, thick with moisture, and an odd, sour smell that smelled faintly like wet copper and unwashed fabric. Brian reached the bottom of the stairs and moved slowly into the kitchen. The flashlight beam revealed that the chrome faucet over the large ceramic sink was turned on full blast, sending a heavy stream of water splashing against the drain. Brian stepped forward and firmly turned off the handle, his heart pounding in his chest. He stood completely still in the dark kitchen, listening intently. That was when he heard a quiet, metallic click directly behind him, coming from the far corner of the kitchen where the old stone cellar door was located. Brian slowly turned the beam of his flashlight toward the corner. The cellar door, which had a heavy brass sliding bolt on the kitchen side that Brian had personally locked before going to bed, was unlatched. The heavy wooden door stood open by roughly 3 inches, revealing a pitch-black gap leading down into the stone basement below. Brian approached the opening slowly, raising his flashlight high to illuminate the wooden stairs leading downward. The air coming up from the basement was frigid, carrying a sharp draft that made his skin prickle. He took a step down onto the first basement tread, then the second, his eyes scanning the stone foundation walls, the vintage cast-iron furnace, and the rows of empty wooden fruit shelves. Everything appeared still. He reached the dirt and stone floor of the basement and swung the light toward the far back wall, near the crawlspace access that led beneath the rear addition of the house. There, tucked away behind an old stack of vintage storm windows, Brian noticed something he had never seen before. A large sheet of decorative wood paneling, which appeared firmly nailed to the foundation wall, was slightly misaligned, sitting a few inches away from the stone mortar. Brian walked over to the paneling and pulled it back with his left hand, shining the flashlight directly into the hidden recess behind it. The beam cut through the dark, illuminating a tight, excavated cavity carved deep beneath the structural foundation of the house. Inside the hidden enclosure sat a sleeping bag, several empty food cans with brand names purchased from the local Mount Vernon grocery store within the past 2 weeks, a pair of worn sneakers, a battery-operated radio with the power light glowing faint amber, and an open spiral notebook containing detailed, handwritten timelines tracking every single hour of the Whitmore family's daily schedule. And just beyond the edge of the sleeping bag, disappearing into a narrow crawl space that ran directly between the floor joists of the living room above, Brian saw a pair of wide, unblinking human eyes staring directly back into the light. For a fraction of a second, Brian could not process what he was looking at. His brain desperately tried to fit those wide, bloodshot eyes into a rational category, an animal, a reflection on glass, an illusion created by the shadows and his own sleep-deprived mind. Then, the eyes blinked. A sharp, violent rasp of breath cut through the silence of the crawlspace, and the figure suddenly shifted backward, retreating deeper into the narrow gap between the heavy timber floor joists. The spell of paralysis broke instantly. Pure, primal adrenaline surged through Brian's body. He did not yell down into the void. He did not attempt to negotiate. He backed away from the false wall as fast as his feet could carry him, scrambled up the wooden basement stairs 2 at a time, slammed the heavy cellar door shut, and threw the brass sliding latch with all the force in his arms. He bolted up the main staircase to the second floor, his heart hammering against his ribs like a sledgehammer. He pushed into the primary bedroom, slammed the door, and locked it behind him. Elena was already sitting up in bed, clutching Lucas tightly against her chest, her eyes wide with fear as she saw the sheer terror written across her husband's face. Brian pulled his phone from his pocket with shaking hands, dialed 911, and kept his voice to a harsh, urgent whisper, telling the Knox County emergency dispatcher that there was an active intruder living inside the structural walls and basement of their home, and that his family was currently barricaded in the upstairs bedroom. For 20 agonizing minutes, the Whitmores sat huddled in absolute darkness, listening. Through the wooden floorboards beneath their bed, they could hear the unmistakable, calculated sounds of movement inside the crawlspace walls, slow, deliberate scuffling, the muffled rustle of clothing against wood, and the faint creak of ceiling laths directly below the hallway. The entity they had spent 7 months believing to be a ghost, a demon, or a restless spirit was right there beneath their feet, navigating the hollow cavities of the house like a rodent in a maze. Finally, the flashing red and blue lights of 3 Knox County Sheriff Patrol cruisers swept across the bedroom ceiling through the rain-streaked windows. 4 armed deputies entered the farmhouse through the front door, clearing the ground floor before coming upstairs to escort Brian, Elena, and Lucas safely out to a waiting vehicle in the driveway. With the family secured, deputies descended into the stone cellar with flashlights and service weapons drawn. Behind the false wood paneling, they uncovered an extensive, concealed, subterranean living system that had been modified with disturbing ingenuity. The individual had dug out additional soil to create clearance beneath the foundation, tapped directly into the home's primary electrical junction box to run low-voltage charging cables and a small space heater, and used the old gravity-fed heating duct system as both an acoustic listening network and a physical pathway to access the voids between the walls. Small, neatly cut viewports, no larger than the head of a nail, were discovered drilled through the baseboards and closet walls of nearly every room, including Lucas's bedroom and the primary bath, allowing the intruder to monitor the family's every movement without ever being seen. The unexplained open cabinets, the moved items, the unlocked doors, and the shattered vase on the hearth had not been supernatural poltergeist activity at all. They were the deliberate actions of a man slipping in and out of the living space in the dead of night while the family slept, taking food, observing their private routines, and systematically tilting the security cameras to cover his tracks. Deputies followed the crawl space to a narrow exterior ventilation shaft on the east side of the foundation, where the metal grate had been carefully unbolted from the inside. Roughly 45 minutes later, K9 units tracked a scent trail through the dense woods behind the property, discovering 52-year-old Arthur Pendleton hiding inside a dilapidated hunting blind a quarter of a mile into the tree line, shivering in soaked clothing. When investigators ran his background, the final, chilling truth of the situation came to light. Arthur was not an escaped convict or a random drifter. He was the estranged, disinherited younger brother of the deceased dairy farmer who had previously owned the property. When the estate was sold off by distant relatives following his brother's death, Arthur felt entirely cheated out of what he believed was his rightful ancestral home. He had moved into the crawl spaces and foundation cavities weeks before the house was ever put on the market in 2021. He had lived completely undetected underneath the floorboards for nearly 9 continuous months, watching the Whitmore family move in, unpack their lives, raise their son, and slowly descend into psychological torment. His ultimate goal, as detailed in the extensive notes recovered from his underground bunker, had not been an immediate violent attack. He had deliberately staged the phantom phenomena to make the family believe the farmhouse was violently haunted, hoping to drive them insane with fear until they broke their lease, abandoned the property, and left him alone in the only home he had ever known. Brian and Elena packed their essential belongings that very morning under police escort, checked into a hotel in Columbus, and never spent another night inside the house. Within 2 months, the property was sold at a massive loss, a stark and permanent reminder that the most terrifying monsters in the dark are never ghosts, but the very real, flesh and blood people hiding just inches behind the wall. In late September of 2022, a 33-year-old architectural photographer named Julian Mercer purchased what he believed was the renovation opportunity of a lifetime. Julian had spent over a decade living in a cramped rental unit in downtown Chicago, shooting commercial real estate and historic buildings across the Midwest. He possessed a sharp eye for classic carpentry, masonry, and hidden structural potential. For years, he had saved nearly every dollar he earned, waiting for the right moment to buy an older property with genuine historical value that he could restore with his own hands. He eventually found a listing for an isolated 2-story Victorian colonial house located on the rural outskirts of Galena, Illinois. The house was constructed in 1894, resting quietly at the end of an overgrown gravel lane bordered by old limestone bluffs and dense stands of bur oak trees. It had sat vacant and neglected for nearly 16 months after the estate of its previous owner, a reclusive former municipal archivist named Walter Halloway, was quietly settled through a county probate auction. The purchase price was remarkably low for a home with original pocket doors, carved walnut mantels, and intact leaded glass windows. When Julian toured the property alongside a local real estate representative on a brisk autumn afternoon, the house smelled heavily of damp plaster, oxidized wallpaper paste, and cold pine boards. Yet, structurally, the stone foundation was level, the roof rafters were solid, and the property offered absolute seclusion. Julian finalized the purchase on October 6th, packed his camera equipment and carpentry tools into an enclosed utility trailer, and moved in just as the autumn foliage began turning deep crimson across Joe Daviess County. During the first month, Julian worked relentlessly from dawn until well after midnight. He systematically cleared out decades of water-damaged wallpaper, sanded back layers of discolored polyurethane from the ground floor oak floors, and set up a temporary living quarter in the smaller front bedroom on the second floor. The house was drafty, and the autumn winds whistling through the limestone bluffs often produced low, hollow moans across the exterior cedar siding. But Julian was thoroughly accustomed to the peculiar acoustic quirks of century-old architecture. When floorboards groaned or old window sash weights rattled in their pockets, he simply logged them as minor renovation tasks to address in due time. However, by mid-November 2022, winter arrived early in northwestern Illinois. Heavy sleet storms gave way to sustained freezing temperatures, coating the bluffs in sheets of gray ice and cutting off easy vehicle travel down the unpaved lane. Julian spent almost all his waking hours indoors, focusing his attention on the large, neglected formal study located at the back of the ground floor. The study was an unusual room. It featured heavy dark oak wall paneling, a sealed brick hearth, and wall-to-wall industrial carpeting that was stiff, discolored, and held down with rusted perimeter tack strips. The previous owner had evidently installed the thick carpet sometime in the late 1980s to cover whatever lay beneath. Whenever the outdoor temperature dropped into the single digits, Julian noticed that the air directly over the center of this carpeted room was consistently 10 to 15 degrees colder than the rest of the ground floor, carrying a faint, unmistakable scent of mineral dust, damp lime mortar, and stagnant water. On the evening of the 3rd of December 2022, Julian decided it was finally time to strip the unsightly carpet down to the subfloor. He strapped on a pair of heavy leather work gloves, positioned a utility knife, and began cutting the carpet into manageable 2-foot strips along the east wall. As he pulled the thick, decaying foam underlayment away from the floorboards near the center of the room, his pry bar caught against a raised seam in the wood. Julian pulled the remaining section of carpet back with a hard, decisive jerk, sending a small cloud of dry gray dust into the beam of his halogen work lamp. Resting directly in the center of the bare pine subfloor was a square wooden trapdoor, measuring roughly 3 feet by 3 feet. The hatch was flush with the surrounding floorboards, framed by heavy iron strapping that had oxidized into a dull, velvety dark brown. In the center of the hatch sat a recessed iron ring pull held flat by a rusted pivot pin. What caught Julian's attention immediately, however, was not the existence of a cellar hatch in an old farmhouse, but rather the way it had been secured. Across the seam of the trapdoor, 2 heavy flat steel brackets had been anchored directly into the surrounding subfloor joists with 6 heavy 3-inch hex lag bolts. Furthermore, someone had driven several large steel masonry nails directly through the frame of the hatch itself, effectively pinning the door shut against its wooden ledge. It was not simply closed, it had been deliberately, forcefully sealed from above. Julian knelt beside the hatch, inspecting the oxidized steel brackets under the glare of his halogen light. The ironwork looked vintage, but the steel brackets and hex bolts appeared far newer, dating perhaps to the early 1990s. A wave of professional curiosity overcame him. In older Victorian homes across the Midwest, hidden cellar access panels often led to forgotten fruit cellars, coal bunkers, or historical cisterns that had simply fallen out of use when modern plumbing was installed. Julian grabbed an adjustable socket wrench from his tool bag, knelt over the first bracket, and began loosening the bolts. The steel bolts resisted at first, shrieking loudly as the rusted threads broke free from the centuries-old oak joists beneath. One by one, Julian extracted all 12 lag bolts, tossing the rusted hardware into an empty plastic paint bucket. He then wedged his flat pry bar beneath the seams of the hatch, prying up the heavy masonry nails until the wood gave a sharp, wet crack. Julian hooked his fingers around the recessed iron ring pull, planted his work boots firmly against the pine floorboards, and pulled upward with all his strength. With a deep, resonant groan of protesting wood and grinding iron hinges, the heavy square trapdoor swung open, falling back against the bare subfloor with a dull thud. A sudden, freezing updraft rushed out from the dark square void in the floor, carrying a smell so dense, stale, and metallic that Julian had to pull his shirt collar over his nose and mouth to keep from coughing. The air did not smell like an ordinary earthen basement. It smelled like ancient stone, wet iron, and a strange, sweet organic decay that reminded him of wet river silt baking in the sun. Julian picked up his high-powered LED rechargeable spotlight, walked to the edge of the opening, and pointed the beam downward into the dark. Directly beneath the hatch was a steep, narrow flight of rough-hewn limestone steps, descending at a sharp 45-degree angle into the earth. The stone steps were completely dry, covered in a fine layer of white efflorescence and loose limestone grit. The space did not match the layout of the standard crawlspace located under the rest of the house. It extended far deeper, tunneling directly downward beneath the natural bedrock shelf on which the house was built. Julian shone the light as far down the stone staircase as the beam would reach. Roughly 20 feet below, the steps ended at a low-ceilinged corridor constructed of dry-stacked limestone blocks, stretching horizontally into the shadows toward the rear bluff behind the property. Julian checked his watch. It was 9:45 in the evening. Outside, the wind was picking up, rattling the bare branches of the oak trees against the study window panes. He knew he should have waited until daylight to explore the subterranean structure, but the architectural mystery was simply too compelling to ignore. He clipped a small emergency flashlight to his belt, grabbed his primary LED spotlight, and stepped carefully onto the first limestone tread. The stone was shockingly cold, sending a chill straight through the thick rubber soles of his work boots. Step by step, Julian descended into the narrow subterranean shaft, the ceiling lowering until he was forced to bend his neck and shoulders forward to avoid striking his head on the rough bedrock ceiling above. When his boots finally touched the flat stone floor at the bottom of the staircase, he found himself standing in a narrow, vaulted corridor roughly 6 feet high and 4 feet wide. The corridor extended for approximately 30 feet before terminating at a heavy, reinforced wooden door built from thick vertical oak planks bound together by 3 horizontal iron straps. Unlike the trapdoor above, this door had no exterior padlock or latch. Instead, a large circular iron wheel, similar to the pressure wheel on a vintage vault or an industrial bulkhead, was set directly into the center of the oak planks. Julian approached the door slowly, the beam of his spotlight illuminating deep scratches and gouges cut across the face of the wood, running diagonally from the top left corner down to the bottom right. He reached out with his gloved right hand and placed his fingers on the cold iron spokes of the circular wheel. He applied pressure. For a few seconds, the wheel refused to budge, frozen by decades of oxidation. Julian grunted, leaning his entire body weight into the turn. With a loud, metallic clank that echoed sharply through the stone corridor, the internal locking dogs disengaged. The heavy oak door slowly swung inward by 3 inches, drifting open under its own weight into the pitch-black chamber beyond. Julian pushed the door the rest of the way open, holding his spotlight high above his head as he crossed the threshold. The chamber was roughly 12 feet square, entirely hand-carved directly out of the solid limestone bluff. In the center of the room sat a single, heavy wooden table with a straight-backed chair positioned behind it. Resting on the surface of the table was an old battery-operated shortwave radio receiver, several empty glass mason jars, a rusted oil lamp, and a large, leather-bound municipal ledger book with its spine cracked open. Julian stepped toward the table, the sound of his boots crunching loudly on the dry limestone floor. He aimed his spotlight down at the open page of the ledger. The handwriting across the yellowed parchment was dated from October of 1991 through March of 1993, written in the frantic, unsteady script of Walter Halloway, the previous owner. Julian leaned closer, reading the final paragraph written at the bottom of the page, dated the 14th of March, 1993. The entry read, "The subterranean shelf extends beyond the bluff line into the old mining cavity. The sounds do not originate from the riverbed. They are coming from behind the drainage conduit in the west bulkhead. I have welded the intermediate hatch, but the pressure continues to rise against the lower seal every time the ground freezes. If the upper hatch is unbolted from the study floor, the drafts will equalize and the seal on the lower bulkhead will give way. It must remain bolted down under the floor, covering forever." Julian felt a cold knot tighten in the pit of his stomach. He slowly raised the beam of his spotlight from the table, panning the light toward the far western wall of the limestone chamber. There, half concealed behind a crumbling stack of limestone rubble, was a narrow, circular iron drainage conduit, roughly 3 feet in diameter, set deep into the solid rock wall. The heavy circular steel plate that had once sealed the mouth of the conduit was bent outward at a violent 45-degree angle, its heavy retaining rivets sheared cleanly off as though forced from the inside. And from deep within the pitch-black darkness of the open conduit pipe, 40 feet beneath the frozen ground of the property, Julian heard a slow, wet, dragging sound, followed by the faint, rhythmic scraping of metal against raw stone, moving steadily closer toward the chamber entrance. Julian stood frozen in the cold limestone chamber, every instinct in his body screaming at him to turn and run. The sound coming from inside the drainage conduit grew louder and more defined. It was not the movement of a small wild animal. It was heavy, rhythmic, and deliberate. The wet, abrasive sound of heavy canvas or rubber sliding across jagged stone, accompanied by the distinct clinking of rusted metal chain links dragging across the floor of the pipe. Julian did not wait to see what emerged from the darkness. He lunged backward across the threshold of the chamber, grabbed the heavy oak door by its iron frame, and hauled it shut with all the strength in his upper body. The heavy timber slammed into the rock jam with a concussive boom that rattled loose limestone dust from the ceiling. Julian grabbed the circular iron wheel, throwing his entire weight into turning the spokes clockwise until the locking dogs slammed home into the stone wall. A split second after the latches caught, a violent impact struck the other side of the heavy oak door. The entire timber frame bowed outward by an inch, sending a dull, shuddering shockwave through Julian's arms as he held the wheel. Whatever was on the other side threw its weight against the wood a second time, followed by a frantic, jagged scraping sound across the iron banding. Julian let go of the wheel, turned on his heel, and sprinted down the narrow vaulted corridor. He hit the rough-hewn stone staircase at a full run, scrambling up the steep incline on his hands and feet, scraping his palms and knees against the jagged limestone steps. He surged up through the floor, opening into the study, grabbed the wooden edge of the square trapdoor, and threw it down into its frame. The heavy hatch slammed shut with a deafening crack. Julian scrambled across the floor, grabbed his heavy iron pry bar, and jammed the steel wedge deep beneath the perimeter framing of the hatch to brace it against the subfloor. He then dragged his heavy, cast-iron tool chest, weighing nearly 200 pounds, directly over the center of the trapdoor, followed by a solid oak bookshelf he overturned across the seam. He collapsed onto the subfloor, his chest heaving, his hands covered in gray stone dust and blood from scraped knuckles. From deep beneath the floorboards, muffled through 20 feet of bedrock and thick pine framing, came 2 dull, rhythmic thuds, vibrating faintly through the floor of the study. Then, the house fell into absolute, suffocating silence. Julian grabbed his phone from his work jacket, dialed 911, and reported a potential trespasser or active breach in the historical foundation tunnels beneath his property. Within 25 minutes, 3 cruisers from the Joe Daviess County Sheriff Department navigated the icy gravel lane. When deputies arrived, Julian, shivering and visibly shaken, explained the situation, showed them the open subfloor in the rear study, and handed them Walter Halloway's leather-bound ledger. The deputies treated the incident as a hazardous search and rescue operation. They called in local fire department personnel equipped with confined space gear, air quality monitors, and high-intensity tactical lighting. 2 armed deputies and a firefighter moved the heavy barricades, opened the trap door, and carefully descended the limestone steps to clear the subterranean complex. When they reached the vaulted room behind the bulkhead door, the chamber was dead silent. The circular conduit on the west wall was inspected with long-range bore cameras and tactical lights. Beyond the broken steel plate lay an extensive, unmapped network of 19th-century abandoned lead and zinc mining tunnels that honeycombed the entire bluff system beneath galena tunnels that had been officially condemned and sealed with concrete bulkheads along the riverbanks in the early 1930s. Roughly 60 feet inside the conduit pipe, emergency personnel made a gruesome and baffling discovery. Lying wedged inside the narrow stone shaft was a fully preserved, heavy industrial diving harness and canvas immersion suit dating back to the late 1960s, equipped with vintage lead ballast weights, an oxidized brass air valve, and a severed steel safety cable. Inside the heavy canvas suit were the skeletal remains of a man. When the Illinois State Police Forensic Unit processed the remains and matched dental records against historical missing persons reports, the truth behind Walter Halloway's cryptic ledger entries was finally pieced together. The remains belonged to Arthur Vance, a regional civil engineer and subterranean surveyor who had mysteriously vanished in November of 1968 while conducting an illegal, independent inspection of the flooded mining cavities connected to the municipal storm drainage system. For decades, local folklore had assumed Vance had drowned in the Mississippi River after his boat was found adrift near the bluffs. In reality, Vance had penetrated the flooded mining shafts from the lower river entrance, became trapped when an interior collapse crushed his return line, and perished deep within the bedrock labyrinth. The terrifying twist, however, was not the discovery of the decades-old remains, but what had caused them to move toward the hatch on the night Julian unbolted the door. Mining engineers called to inspect the site determined that the abandoned subterranean network was connected to a deep subterranean hydraulic pressure pocket tied to the rising winter water table of the Galena River. When Walter Halloway had welded and bolted the upper trapdoor shut in 1993, he had created an airtight seal that held the hydraulic equilibrium stable between the flooded river conduits and the dry limestone chamber beneath the house. The moment Julian Mercer unbolted the lag bolts and pulled open the heavy trapdoor in the study, the sudden atmospheric pressure drop equalized through the limestone shaft like a massive subterranean siphon. The violent rush of displaced air and subterranean water had forced open the weakened iron conduit plate, creating a powerful hydraulic suction current that dragged the heavy, lead-weighted diving suit and rusted safety chains through 60 feet of jagged stone pipe directly toward the chamber door. There had been no living intruder in the tunnels that night. Julian had come face to face with the preserved remnants of a 50-year-old cold case, literally pulled from the dark by the simple act of opening a sealed door. Julian packed his tools the next morning. He permanently sealed the trapdoor with 8 inches of reinforced structural concrete, repaired the subfloor, and sold the property at the beginning of 2023, never again questioning why some doors in old houses were meant to stay sealed forever. On the bitterly cold morning of the 12th of February, 2021, inside the police department headquarters in Grand Rapids, Michigan, Detective Thomas Wright was reviewing overnight traffic reports when a call came through from the front intake desk. The desk officer sounded distinctly unnerved, stating that a young woman had just staggered into the main lobby barefoot in the snow, claiming she had escaped a violent abduction that had taken place only hours prior. Thomas immediately walked down the hallway to the intake interview room. Sitting on the vinyl chairs was 24-year-old Chloe Henderson, a freelance graphic illustrator and part-time bookstore employee who lived in a quiet residential neighborhood near Heritage Hill. Chloe was in a severe state of physical and emotional trauma. Her hands and ankles exhibited deep, raw lacerations consistent with tight zip-tie bindings. Her winter coat was torn at the seams, her lip was split, and her dark hair was matted with dried dirt and melting road slush. She was hyperventilating, shivering uncontrollably beneath a heavy emergency blanket and clutching a small, half-melted plastic water bottle between trembling fingers. Thomas sat across from her, took out his notepad, and gently asked her to explain what had happened. According to Chloe, the nightmare had started the previous night, February 11th, at approximately 11:30. She had stayed late at the bookstore downtown to reorganize inventory, leaving through the rear alleyway to walk to her apartment 4 blocks away. She stated that, as she turned the corner onto Lion Street, a dark, unmarked cargo van with rusted wheel wells pulled abruptly up to the curb. 2 men wearing dark balaclavas and heavy canvas work jackets lunged out of the sliding side door, threw a rough burlap hood over her head, zip-tied her wrists and ankles, and threw her into the rear cargo hold. Chloe recounted that she was driven for nearly 2 hours down winding, unpaved roads into a rural, heavily wooded area. She was then carried down a steep flight of wooden stairs into an ice-cold subterranean basement smelling of raw copper, motor oil, and damp dirt. She described being chained to an exposed cast iron pipe beneath the floor joists while her captors spoke in low, muffled voices in an adjoining room, discussing plans to demand a large financial ransom from her estranged father, a wealthy real estate attorney in Chicago. Around 5 in the morning, while the 2 men were apparently upstairs arguing, Chloe managed to use the sharp edge of an exposed masonry screw on the foundation wall to saw through the plastic zip ties binding her wrists. She slipped out through a small, ground-level hopper window in the basement wall, ran blindly through the frozen pine woods in the pitch-black darkness, and eventually flagged down an early morning commuter along the shoulder of Northland Drive, who drove her directly to the police station. Thomas took detailed notes, immediately ordering a comprehensive forensic medical examination and securing her torn clothing for DNA evidence. Every detail of Chloe's story was horrifying, consistent, and delivered with the raw, visceral terror of a genuine survivor. The Grand Rapids Police Department immediately launched a massive priority investigation. Because the crime involved an interstate ransom motive and violent felony kidnapping, Thomas coordinated with county sheriff units and regional state investigators to pull traffic camera feeds, check automated license plate readers along Lion Street, and locate the dark cargo van. By 3 in the afternoon, Thomas and his partner, Detective Martin Davis, sat inside the department digital media processing lab to review the city surveillance footage covering the exact intersection of Lion Street and the bookstore alleyway during the timeline of the reported abduction. The security system operated high-definition, commercial-grade digital cameras with excellent infrared night vision capabilities, providing an unobstructed view of the entire block. Thomas cued the timecode to 11:25 on the night of February 11th and pressed play. On the screen, the quiet, snow-dusted street was practically deserted. The halogen streetlights cast long, sharp shadows across the sidewalks. At exactly 11:31, the rear metal door of the bookstore swung open. Chloe stepped out into the alleyway, wearing her winter coat, shouldering her canvas bag, and pulling her wool scarf tight against the freezing wind. Thomas leaned forward toward the monitor, expecting to see the dark cargo van pull up and the masked men emerge from the shadows. Instead, what the detectives saw on the high-resolution footage made them freeze in total bewilderment. Chloe walked down the alleyway alone. She reached the sidewalk on Lion Street, paused under the streetlight for roughly 30 seconds, pulled her smartphone from her pocket, and typed a quick message. There was no van, there was no vehicle idling at the curb, there were no masked assailants hiding in the shadows. At 11:33, Chloe calmly turned south on Division Avenue, completely unhurried, walking at a relaxed, steady pace toward her own apartment building. Thomas rubbed his eyes in disbelief, wondering if there was a timecode synchronization error on the municipal server. He immediately cross-referenced the feeds from 3 separate private business cameras along Division Avenue, a bank ATM, a coffee shop, and a 24-hour convenience store. All 3 cameras showed the exact same thing. Chloe, walking entirely alone through the quiet streets, entering the front glass lobby of her secure apartment building at 11:42, unlocking the security door with her key fob, and stepping inside without a single sign of distress or pursuit. Detective Davis let out a low whistle, looking over at Thomas. Did she fabricate the entire story? Did she inflict those injuries on herself to stage a hoax? Thomas shook his head slowly. The deep ligature marks on Chloe's wrists, the heavy abrasions on her ankles, and the sheer biological panic she had exhibited in the interview room were virtually impossible to fake. A person staging a hoax for attention does not cut their own wrists down to the tissue or freeze their feet to the point of second-degree frostbite. Something horrific had undeniably happened to her, but the timeline and the location she had provided were entirely impossible. Thomas pulled up the apartment building's private interior hallway camera feeds, which the property manager had just emailed over to the precinct. The hallway footage showed Chloe walking up the stairs to her third-floor apartment at 11:44, entering her unit and firmly locking the deadbolt behind her. For nearly 3 hours, the hallway remained completely still and empty. Then, at exactly 2:28 in the morning, the door to Chloe's apartment swung open from the inside. Chloe stepped out into the dimly lit hallway, but she was no longer wearing her shoes, her winter coat, or her scarf. She was wearing only thin flannel pajamas and wool socks. Her posture was completely rigid. Her arms hung limp at her sides, and her head was tilted back at an unnatural, awkward angle. She did not walk down the hallway toward the main front exit. Instead, she turned toward the back fire exit at the end of the corridor, an exit that led directly down into the private, subterranean parking garage and maintenance boiler rooms beneath the historic apartment building. Thomas fast-forwarded the timestamp on the underground garage camera. At 2:35 in the morning, the heavy steel fire door opened, and Chloe entered the concrete garage. She walked past the parked vehicles in the center aisle, moving with that same eerie, stiff, mechanical gait, heading straight toward the far, unlit corner behind the commercial boiler tanks where an old, heavy iron maintenance hatch was set into the foundation wall. As Chloe approached the iron hatch, the motion sensor security light on the ceiling suddenly switched on, illuminating the dark alcove in harsh white glare. Standing beside the open iron hatch, waiting for her in the shadows, was a tall figure wearing a dark canvas coat, heavy work boots, and holding a thick bundle of heavy black plastic zip ties in his hands. And as the figure stepped forward into the full beam of the security light to take Chloe by the arm, the camera captured his face with absolute, undeniable clarity. The face, illuminated under the harsh fluorescent garage light, was not a stranger, an unknown drifter, or a professional kidnapper. It was Dr. Julian Vance, a respected 49-year-old clinical neurologist and sleep medicine specialist at the Grand Rapids Regional Medical Center, the very same physician who had been treating Chloe for severe chronic parasomnia and non-REM sleep disturbances for the past 8 months. Thomas and Davis stared at the screen in complete disbelief. The security footage showed Dr. Vance speaking in a low, calm voice directly into Chloe's ear, handing her a small paper cup of water containing a dissolved liquid sedative, which Chloe drank without resistance while still locked in an active, somnambulic state. Vance then systematically bound her wrists and ankles with the heavy plastic zip ties, threw a rough burlap hood over her head, and dragged her through the heavy iron maintenance door leading down into the decommissioned sub-basement infrastructure beneath the city block. Thomas immediately dispatched 6 patrol units and a SWAT tactical entry team to Dr. Vance's private medical clinic and suburban residence in East Grand Rapids. Within 40 minutes, officers breached Dr. Vance's expansive estate, placing him under arrest in his private study as he sat at his desk reviewing patient clinical files on his laptop. When forensic teams, accompanied by building engineers, searched the subterranean maintenance tunnels beneath Chloe's apartment complex, the entire horrifying scope of the operation was revealed. The decommissioned boiler rooms connected directly to a network of historic utility conduits dating back to the 1920s, running directly beneath several residential properties in Heritage Hill. Vance had rented an old commercial storage unit connected to those tunnels, outfitting the underground vault as an isolated observation facility. When investigators examined the digital files seized from Vance's clinic servers, the chilling psychological reality behind Chloe's report came into clear focus. Chloe had not lied about what she experienced. In her fractured, traumatized mind, the burlap hood, the zip ties, the cold stone floor, and the voices talking about ransom were all terrifyingly real memories. However, because Vance had been prescribing her high doses of experimental hypnotic sedatives to deliberately exploit and deepen her severe sleepwalking disorder, Chloe's brain had entirely confabulated the context of the trauma. When she awoke in the subterranean bunker and managed to escape through the maintenance window, her conscious mind tried to rationalize the horrific ordeal by inventing a daytime street kidnapping scenario on Lion Street, completely unaware that she had walked down into the basement herself under chemical hypnosis. Vance was not holding her for a crude financial ransom. His private digital research logs revealed that he had been conducting illegal, highly classified human behavioral conditioning experiments using targeted sleep deprivation and pharmacological triggers to test whether severe parasomnia patients could be systematically guided to commit complex physical acts without conscious memory. Vance was formally indicted in federal district court on charges of aggravated kidnapping, unlawful human experimentation, distribution of controlled substances, and healthcare fraud. He was convicted on all counts and sentenced to 45 years in federal prison without the possibility of early release. Chloe received specialized psychological trauma therapy and relocated to Chicago to be closer to her family. Having finally learned the truth about why the security footage didn't match her memories, and that the real monster had been hiding behind a lab coat and a medical degree all along,